Good evening, and welcome to Olympus Dreams. Tonight we journey to the very beginning, to a place where darkness was born, and sleep first learned to breathe. Before there were temples or prayers whispered at dusk, before mortals lay down on straw beds or gods reclined on clouds, there was only the void. Chaos stretched endless and formless, neither light nor shadow, neither sound nor silence. It simply was. From that ancient emptiness came Nyx, the night herself, cloaked in darkness so complete that even the void drew back. She emerged not with thunder or proclamation, but with the quiet certainty of something that had always existed and would exist forever. Her hair fell like starless midnight. Her eyes held the depth of every hour between sunset and dawn. She moved through the formless space, and where she passed, the first shadows took shape. Nyx did not seek companionship. She did not require it. Yet from her own essence, from the very fabric of her being, children were born, not through union with another, but through the simple fact that night contains within itself certain truths. Darkness gives birth to dreams, shadow mothers sleep. And so, without father or ceremony, Nyx bore her sons. The first was Thanatos, death itself, who would one day touch every living thing with gentle, inevitable hands. The second was Hypnos, whose arrival was softer still, like fog settling over still water. Hypnos came into being not with a cry, but with a sigh. The first breath he drew was slow and measured. His eyes opened briefly, saw the endless dark around him, and closed again. Even at his birth he carried the weight of drowsiness, the pull of rest, the whisper that says, "Lay down, let go, drift away." Nyx held him in arms woven from twilight. She looked upon this child who barely stirred, whose breathing was so gentle it seemed the universe itself might be lulled by its rhythm. There was no celebration of his arrival, no proclamation, only the quiet acknowledgement that something necessary had entered the world, something all beings, mortal and divine alike, would one day need. As Hypnos grew, if one could call it growth, he remained unchanged in his essential nature. He did not run through the void like his brother Thanatos, who walked with purpose even then, measuring out the spans of future lives. Hypnos simply existed, always half between one state and another, never fully awake, never truly unconscious. His mother watched him with something close to affection. Among her many children, born from the folds of night, Hypnos was the gentlest. While others would bring fear or strife, vengeance or blame, he brought only rest. Even in the formless time before the world took shape, rest was needed. The void itself grew weary of its own emptiness. The realm where they dwelt was not yet a place with boundaries or form. It existed beneath what would one day be called the world, in the spaces where light feared to venture. Here, in this proto-underworld of shadow and potential, Hypnos began to understand his nature. He discovered that when he breathed deeply, a heaviness spread through the darkness around him. When he sighed, the very fabric of the void seemed to soften. If he closed his eyes, phantom images flickered at the edges of creation. Dreams before there was anything to dream about. Nyx saw this and knew her son would be powerful, though his power would never announce itself with force or fury. It would creep in quietly, settling over consciousness like dust over unused furniture. It would arrive unbidden and leave the same way, taking memory of itself along. She began to teach him in the way night teaches all who dwell within it, not through words, but through simple presence. She showed him how darkness could be shelter rather than threat, how the absence of light need not mean the absence of comfort, how every end contained within it the seed of beginning, and every sleep was both a small death and a renewal. Hypnos listened in his half-sleeping way, absorbing truths without seeming to pay attention. His understanding grew like moss on stone, gradual and complete. Time passed, though time had not yet learned to measure itself properly. The void began to shift. Chaos stirred, producing the first solid things. Gaia emerged, broad and patient. Uranus spread overhead, star-studded and distant. the world began its long process of becoming. And still Hypnos remained in the deep places, in the caverns beneath consciousness, in the spaces between waking and forgetting. His realm began to take shape around him, forming itself according to his nature rather than any deliberate design. It became a place of perpetual twilight. Neither day nor night, but the soft grey hour when the mind releases its grip on the need to be alert. Poppies grew there, though no seed was planted. Their red petals drooped heavy on pale stems. Rivers formed, flowing slow and silent, their waters dark and dreamlike. The sound they made was not quite sound, more like the memory of distant rain. Here Hypnos built his dwelling. If one could call it building when walls formed themselves from mist and foundations were laid from sighs. It was a cave, vast and comfortable, opening into hillsides that had never seen sun. The entrance was hidden behind curtains of shadow that parted for no one unless he willed it. Inside, the air was thick and warm, neither stifling nor fresh, but perfectly balanced for rest. Every surface was smooth, every corner rounded. There were no sharp edges to catch the eye or mind. The ceiling dripped with moisture that never quite fell, suspended in that moment before the drop becomes the splash. Hypnos furnished this place with simple things: a bed of soft down, darker than black, cushions that seemed to breathe in rhythm with whoever approached them, silence that was not empty but full, pregnant with the possibility of dreams yet to be dreamed. His brother Thanatos visited him there, standing at the threshold between waking and sleep. Death did not enter fully. Even he felt the pull of the drowsiness that saturated every breath of air. "You will be needed," Thanatos told him, his voice certain and clear. When life begins above, when creatures walk and think and strive, they will require what you offer. Hypnos nodded slowly, understanding without fully waking to it. Yes, they would need him. They would need rest, respite, the temporary cessation of consciousness. They would need dreams to process what their waking minds could not. And so he waited, as he had always waited, in that timeless way that only sleep can teach. He waited in his cave beneath the world, while above him creation unfolded, while gods warred and mortals were shaped from clay, while cities rose and heroes were born. He waited because waiting was his nature, and when the world was finally ready for him, when the first exhausted being finally laid down and closed their eyes, he would be there. He had always been there. He would always be there. In the deep places where night gives birth to necessary things, Hypnos breathed his slow, eternal breaths, and the universe, still young and learning, began to understand the gift of rest. The waiting was not empty. It was not the restless anticipation of one who expects something to arrive at a particular moment. Rather, it was the deep, patient stillness of stone worn smooth by water that has not yet begun to flow. Hypnos existed in his cave the way shadows exist beneath trees. Present, constant, neither eager nor reluctant. He spent his time learning the texture of his own nature. Sometimes he would rest upon the dark bed and feel the weight of his body, or what approximated a body in this place where forms were still negotiable. The sensation was neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It simply was. A heaviness that anchored him to something resembling existence while allowing his consciousness to drift through layers of half-formed thought. Other times he would walk the perimeter of his dwelling, trailing his fingers along walls that felt like solidified mist. The surfaces were cool but not cold, damp but not wet. They held the memory of temperature without committing fully to it. He found this comforting. Nothing here demanded absolute definition. Everything existed in the gentle space between. The rivers outside his cave called to him in their wordless way. He would sometimes stand at the entrance, watching the dark water slide past. The current moved with purpose, but without hurry. It knew where it was going, even if that destination had not yet been determined. Fish swam there, or perhaps the idea of fish. Their silver forms flickered just beneath the surface, visible only when the mind was not quite focused on seeing them. Hypnos understood this. He was becoming familiar with the paradox of his realm. Things existed here most completely when they were not examined too closely. Dreams operated by similar principles. The moment one tried to grasp them fully, they dissolved like smoke through fingers. He walked beside the river sometimes, following its meandering path through the twilight landscape. Poppies nodded as he passed, their heavy heads swaying without wind. Their scent hung in the air, thick and sweet, a perfume of forgetting. Not the harsh erasure of memory, but the gentle dissolution of sharp edges, the softening of what needed to be soft. The land itself breathed. He could feel it beneath his feet. A slow rise and fall, like the chest of some vast sleeping creature. Perhaps the realm was asleep. Perhaps it had always been asleep. Perhaps he was walking through the dreams of the void itself, exploring the landscape of chaos as it learned to rest. Time continued its strange, fluid dance. Above, in the world that was building itself piece by piece, gods discovered their appetites. Zeus claimed the sky with thunder and pride. Poseidon carved kingdoms from the sea. Hades walked into the underworld and claimed dominion over the dead, but none of them descended deep enough to reach this place. None of them found the soft grey country where Hypnos dwelt. This suited him perfectly. He did not desire company, nor did he fear solitude. Both were simply conditions of existence, neither more valuable than the other. Thanatos visited occasionally, standing always at the threshold, never quite entering. Death brought news from above when he remembered, though his reports were vague and uninterested. Mortals walk now, Thanatos said once. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere. They stumble about with their brief, bright lives. They think themselves important. Hypnos considered this. Do they rest? Not enough. They fight sleep. They fear it might not return them. This puzzled Hypnos in his distant way. Why would sleep not return them? Sleep was not imprisonment. It was release. It was the temporary setting down of burdens too heavy to carry without pause. It was the space where the worn fabric of consciousness could repair itself, cell by cell, breath by breath. But he did not argue. He simply nodded. Perhaps mortals would learn. Perhaps they would not. It made little difference to him. His gift would be there regardless, waiting with the patience of deep water. He returned to his cave and sat upon a cushion that moulded itself to his form. The air wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, for he was never quite awake, but to deepen the state between, to sink further into the soft grey country of his nature. In this state, awareness became something different. It was not the sharp focus of waking thought, nor the complete absence of consciousness. It was the dreamy mind, observing without judgment, accepting without question. Images drifted through him like leaves on the surface of his rivers. He saw fragments of the world above. Mortals beneath the stars, their faces turned upward, the flicker of their fires against cave walls, the weight of their eyelids as exhaustion crept through them. He felt their resistance, their stubborn insistence on staying alert despite the body's pleading. And he understood then what Thanatos had meant. These creatures did not yet trust him. They had not learned that surrender was sometimes the greatest strength, that letting go was not loss but transformation, that closing the eyes was not blindness but a different kind of seeing, patience, he thought. Though thinking was perhaps too strong a word for the gentle acknowledgment that drifted through his half-conscious mind. They would learn. In time. Time, after all, was something he had in infinite supply. He felt, rather than heard, Nyx approaching. His mother moved through the realm like weather, inevitable and encompassing. She did not knock or announce herself. She was simply there, a presence darker than the surrounding darkness, a depth beneath depth. "You are content here," she said. It was not a question. Content was not the right word, but Hypnos lacked a better one. He was himself here. This place matched his nature so completely that he and it were nearly indistinguishable. The realm was Hypnos. Hypnos was the realm. Separation was an illusion maintained only for the sake of conversation. "The world above will call for you," Nyx continued. Her voice was the sound of distant wind through empty halls. "They will need what you offer, but they will also resent you for it. Mortals will curse you even as they depend upon you. Gods will fear your power even as they seek your favor." Hypnos absorbed this without concern. Resentment and gratitude were both forms of acknowledgement. Neither touched the essential truth of what he was. Sleep would come regardless of what was felt about it. Rest would arrive whether welcomed or resisted. He was not a being who required worship or appreciation. He simply was. "And when they call," Nyx asked, "will you answer?" He opened his eyes halfway. The cave around him shimmered in the perpetual twilight, beautiful in its simplicity. The poppies beyond the entrance swayed in their windless rhythm. The rivers sang their silent songs. Everything was as it had always been, as it would always be. "I am already here," he said. They need only close their eyes. Nyx smiled, or perhaps she did not. In the darkness, expressions were difficult to read. She departed as silently as she had arrived, leaving only a lingering sense of approval, ancient and deep. Hypnos settled deeper into his cushion. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the realm. The moisture on the ceiling finally fell, a single drop that made no sound as it landed. Somewhere far away, a mortal closed their eyes for the first time in trust rather than exhaustion. And in that moment, Hypnos fulfilled his purpose without moving, without effort, without even the awareness of having done anything at all. He was sleep itself, patient and eternal, waiting in the soft grey country beneath the world. The gift was given. The gift was received. And the cycle, which had no beginning, continued as it always would. Beyond the entrance of his cave, where the poppies swayed in their endless rhythm, a new presence arrived. This one was different from Thanatos and Nyx. It did not belong to the realm of shadow and depth. It carried with it the scent of sunlight, the residue of altitude, the crisp awareness of the waking world. Hermes stood at the threshold. The messenger god did not cross into the cave. Perhaps some instinct warned him against it. Perhaps he simply knew better than to step fully into a place where his nature would be so fundamentally challenged. He remained on the boundary, one foot on stone still touched by the grey light, the other poised for retreat. Hypnos felt the arrival without opening his eyes. The presence of the messenger god was like a small bright coin dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward, disturbing nothing, yet impossible to ignore. "Sleep," Hermes said. His voice carried the faint breathlessness of someone who had just descended a very long stairway. "Zeus sends word." Hypnos opened his eyes but did not rise. The cushion beneath him held him gently, and movement seemed an unnecessary complication. He regarded the messenger with mild curiosity. Zeus rarely sent word to this place. The king of gods preferred to forget that Hypnos existed until necessity made forgetting impossible. "What does he require?" Hypnos asked. His voice emerged soft as ever, neither eager nor reluctant. Hermes shifted his weight. His winged sandals twitched slightly, as if the feathers themselves grew uncomfortable in the heavy air. "He requests your presence on Olympus. There is a matter that requires your particular gift." The word gift hung in the air between them. Hermes did not elaborate. He did not need to. When gods spoke of Hypnos's gift, they meant his power. The ability to close eyes that wished to remain open. To bring rest to minds too troubled or too watchful to surrender on their own. Hypnos considered this. Olympus was far from his cave. It existed in bright marble and sharp edges, in declarations and demands. The very air there crackled with wakefulness, with the constant need to be seen, to be heard, to matter. The thought of ascending to such a place made him feel heavier, as if his own nature protested the journey before it began. "Who does Zeus wish me to touch?" he asked. Hermes hesitated. That part was always difficult to speak aloud. The god of sleep could put anyone to rest, kings, monsters, mortals, even gods themselves. The power was absolute within its narrow domain, and Zeus, for all his thunder and authority, needed that power sometimes. There is a war, Hermes said carefully, above among mortals. Zeus has taken an interest, but there is another god who opposes his will in this matter. A god who watches too closely and interferes too often. Hypnos understood without further explanation. Zeus wanted someone else's eyes closed while he moved pieces on the mortal board. It was not the first time such a request had been made. It would not be the last. The gods played their games with mortal lives, and sleep was sometimes the kindest weapon available. He does not ask lightly, Hermes added, as if this might make a difference. Hypnos rose slowly from his cushion. His movements were unhurried, deliberate as the turning of seasons. Around him the cave seemed to exhale. The moisture on the walls gathered itself into new droplets. The rivers beyond the entrance murmured in their wordless language. "Tell Zeus I will consider his request," Hypnos said. Hermes blinked. Gods did not often tell Zeus they would consider his requests. Requests from the king of gods were generally understood to be commands wrapped in polite language, but Hermes was wise enough not to say this. He simply nodded. "When shall I return for your answer?" he asked. "When the answer is ready," Hypnos replied. "Time here is different." You know this. Hermes did know this. He had felt it the moment he crossed into the realm. Minutes stretched like hours. Hours compressed into heartbeats. The usual measures meant nothing in a place where consciousness itself became negotiable. The messenger god departed without further argument. His winged sandals carried him upward through the layers of earth and shadow. Back toward the bright world where gods and mortals moved in straight lines and called it progress, Hypnos returned to his cushion. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he walked to the entrance of his cave and looked out at the landscape that was both kingdom and self. The poppies bent their heavy heads toward him. The rivers flowed in their eternal circuits. Far in the distance, where the grey light faded into deeper grey, shapes moved that might have been creatures or might have been the slow dreams of the land itself. Zeus wanted his power. They all wanted his power eventually. Hera had come once, asking him to close her husband's eyes so she might act unobserved. Poseidon had sent messengers requesting he put coastal villages to sleep before tidal waves arrived, a mercy that was also a convenience. Athena herself, goddess of wisdom and wakefulness, had stood at this very threshold and asked if he might dull the nightmares of a hero she favoured. Hypnos had granted some requests and refused others. Not based on politics or favour, but on something more fundamental. He could feel when sleep was appropriate and when it was violation. There was a difference between the rest that healed and the unconsciousness that merely concealed. He knew that difference in his bones, in the core of his being. This request from Zeus troubled him in a way he could not immediately name. He stepped out among the poppies. Their scent rose around him, thick and drowsy. He touched one flower gently. Its petals were cool beneath his fingers, soft as the border between waking and dreaming. The poppy leaned into his touch, or perhaps he imagined it did. In this place the line between occurrence and imagination was pleasantly blurred, a war among mortals. Gods taking sides, one god watching too closely while another wished to act unseen. The pattern was old. He had witnessed it before in fragments, in the images that drifted through his half-sleeping awareness. Mortals died. Gods raged or mourned or celebrated depending on which mortals had fallen. The wheel turned. The cycle continued. But something about this request felt different. Perhaps it was the weight of inevitability he sensed behind it. Or perhaps it was simply that Zeus, in asking for this particular favour, had acknowledged a truth the king of gods preferred to ignore. That even he, wielder of lightning and master of sky, was subject to the same fundamental needs as any creature. That consciousness was not infinite. That awareness required rest. That power itself needed pause. Hypnos walked along the riverbank. The silver fish beneath the surface swam in lazy spirals, their movements hypnotic. He watched them for a time that could have been moments or hours. The rhythm of their swimming matched the rhythm of his breathing, which matched the rhythm of the land beneath his feet. Finally he returned to his cave. He lay upon his bed, the one made of soft darkness and accumulated silence. Above him, new moisture gathered on the ceiling in patient beads. He would go to Olympus. He had already decided, though the decision felt less like choice and more like recognition. The pattern required his presence there. The cycle demanded this particular turning. Refusing would not stop what was coming. It would only mean his absence from it, but he would go in his own time, by his own path. Not as a servant summoned, but as a force acknowledged. Sleep came when it came. It could be invited but not commanded, welcomed but not controlled. Somewhere far above, on bright Olympus where gods argued and schemed, Zeus waited for an answer. Let him wait. Waiting was its own kind of lesson. Even kings could learn patience, given enough time and the right teacher. Hypnos closed his eyes. The realm around him deepened, and in that deepening the journey had already begun. The path to Olympus was not a path in any conventional sense. It required no wings, no climbing, no particular direction through space. Hypnos simply allowed the realm around him to thin, to grow less dense, less certain of its own boundaries. The cave walls became suggestions rather than facts. The moisture-beaded ceiling grew transparent, then absent. He rose through layers of consciousness the way morning rises through water. Slowly, inevitably, without effort or struggle. The grey twilight of his domain gave way to something brighter, though brightness itself felt almost offensive after so long in comfortable shadow. Colours emerged that had no business being so loud, blues that shouted, golds that demanded attention. The air tasted different here, sharp and clean, lacking the drowsy weight he preferred. Olympus materialized around him like a thought becoming solid. Marble columns, impossibly high ceilings, light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the gods had decided mere sunlight was insufficient and created something more assertive. He stood at the edge of the great hall. Gods moved about their business with the particular energy of beings who believed themselves perpetually important. Voices echoed off stone. Laughter rang too bright. Everything here moved too quickly, thought too loudly, existed too insistently. Hypnos remained at the threshold. He did not announce himself. Announcement seemed unnecessary. Sleep required no introduction. It arrived when it arrived. Zeus noticed him eventually. The king of gods sat on his throne, magnificent and restless, one hand holding his thunderbolt, like a man might hold a walking stick he did not actually need, but enjoyed carrying regardless. His eyes found Hypnos across the hall, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief. Not quite wariness. Something between. The god of sleep waited. He had become very good at waiting. Zeus rose. He descended from his throne with the measured steps of someone performing authority rather than simply possessing it. Other gods fell silent as he approached. They watched with the polite curiosity of beings who sensed something interesting might occur, but were not yet certain what. "You came," Zeus said when he stood before him. "I came." Hypnos agreed. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. Quiet had its own kind of weight, its own way of filling space. The hall around them seemed to settle slightly, to grow less insistent in its brightness. Zeus gestured toward a smaller chamber off the main hall. A private conversation, then. The king of gods preferred to negotiate away from an audience. Hypnos followed, his footsteps making no sound against the polished marble. The chamber was smaller, but no less grand. A table of dark wood, chairs that looked more decorative than comfortable. Windows that opened onto views of clouds and distant mountains, landscapes that shifted slightly when one was not looking directly at them. Hypnos did not sit. Neither did Zeus, though the king of gods looked as if he wanted to. They stood across from each other, separated by the table and something less tangible. "Thank you for coming," Zeus began. The words carried formality but not warmth. "I know your time moves differently than ours. All time moves the same," Hypnos replied. "Only the awareness of it changes." Zeus nodded as if he understood, though his eyes suggested he did not quite. The king of gods was a creature of action, of lightning-quick decisions and immediate results. The subtle movements of consciousness were not his domain. "I need your help," Zeus said. "The war among the mortals grows complicated. There are gods who interfere when they should not, who watch when I need them to look away." "You want someone put to sleep," Hypnos said. It was not a question. "I want the scales balanced," Zeus corrected. Then, after a pause, "Yes." Someone put to sleep. Hypnos walked to the window. Below, the mortal world spread out in miniature. Somewhere down there, men fought and died over causes they believed mattered. Gods moved among them, invisible or disguised, tilting battles with whispers and small interventions. The pattern was ancient. It would repeat until the end of time or the end of patterns, whichever came first. "Who?" Hypnos asked. Zeus hesitated. The hesitation was interesting. It revealed more than words might have. "My brother Zeus," said finally. "Poseidon watches the coastal battles too closely. His favorites among the mortals gain advantages they should not have. The balance tips. I need him to rest. Just for a time. Just long enough." Hypnos turned from the window. He looked at Zeus with eyes that had seen every sleeping face in creation, every dream that had ever flickered behind closed lids. The king of gods held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "You asked me to put a god to sleep unwillingly," Hypnos said. "To close the eyes of one who does not seek rest. I ask you to restore balance," Zeus replied. His voice carried the edge of command now, the thunder beneath the words. "Is that not what sleep does? Is that not part of your domain?" "Sleep restores," Hypnos agreed. "When it is welcome, when the time is right. But there is a difference between rest and imprisonment, between pause and violation." Zeus's expression hardened. "I am king of the gods," he said quietly. "I do not ask lightly, and I am sleep itself," Hypnos replied just as quietly. "I do not act lightly either." The silence between them grew thick. Outside the window, clouds moved past in formations that suggested purpose, but revealed nothing. Time stretched in that particular way it does when large decisions balance on small moments. "What would you have me do?" Zeus said finally. The question was not quite a plea, but no longer a command. It was something between, the sound of power discovering its limits. Hypnos considered. He thought of his cave, of the poppies and the silver fish. He thought of the pattern that had brought him here, the cycle that demanded this particular turning. He thought of the difference between the sleep that healed and the sleep that merely concealed. "I will help you," he said, "but not as you ask." Zeus's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "I will not force your brother to sleep," Hypnos said. "Force creates resistance. Resistance creates waking, but I can make rest appealing. I can make consciousness feel heavy. I can remind him that even gods grow weary, that even the sea needs pause between its waves." Zeus listened. His fingers drummed once against the table, then stilled. "How long would this take?" he asked. "As long as necessary," Hypnos replied. Sleep cannot be rushed. It must be invited, not commanded. The king of gods studied him. For a long moment Hypnos thought Zeus might refuse, might thunder and demand, and make the mistake of believing power could overwhelm the simple need for rest. But Zeus had not become king by ignoring wisdom when it appeared, even in forms he did not prefer. "Do what you must," Zeus said, "but do it soon." The war will not wait for gentle persuasion. War never does, Hypnos agreed. But sleep will come regardless. It always does. He turned toward the door. Behind him, Zeus remained standing by the window, a figure of authority beginning to understand the limits of authority itself. Hypnos walked back through the great hall. Gods paused in their conversations to watch him pass. He did not acknowledge their stares. He simply moved through their bright world like a shadow, like a promise, like the inevitable evening that follows even the longest day. Outside, the air was still too sharp, still too insistent, but he could feel the pattern settling around him, the cycle finding its groove. He had agreed to help, not because Zeus commanded it, but because the request, modified and understood properly, aligned with something deeper. Even gods needed rest. Even power required pause. These were truths older than thrones or thunder. Hypnos closed his eyes. The bright world of Olympus began to fade. Around him, the familiar grey of his domain reformed, patient as always, waiting as always. The poppies would still be swaying. The rivers would still flow in their endless circuits. And somewhere beneath it all his cushioned bed waited, knowing, as it had always known, that he would return. He returned to a realm that understood waiting. The grey light settled around him like an old coat. The moisture-beaded walls gleamed faintly. Somewhere in the depths, water moved over smooth stones with the patience of centuries. The sound was neither loud nor soft. It simply was. A constant that required no attention and offered none. Hypnos stood at the threshold between Olympus and home, between demand and stillness. He did not move immediately forward. There was no need. Time here bent differently. A moment could stretch into hours. Hours could collapse into heartbeats. The realm shaped itself around necessity rather than decree. He walked deeper into the cave. The poppies swayed as he passed, their heads heavy with seeds that held forgetfulness. Red petals caught what little light existed and softened it further. The grey became warmer. The air tasted of earth and quiet growing things. His cushioned bed waited where it always waited, unchanged. Patient, it asked nothing. It simply remained, ready to receive him or ignore his absence with equal grace. But Hypnos did not lie down. Instead, he moved to the edge of one of the silver rivers that wound through his domain. The water reflected nothing. It was not quite liquid and not quite light. Fish moved beneath the surface, their scales catching illumination that came from no visible source. They swam in patterns that suggested purpose but revealed none. He knelt at the water's edge. His reflection did not appear in the flowing silver. Only the subtle movement of current, endless and circular. He thought about Zeus's request. No, not request. Zeus had commanded, then bargained, then accepted what could be offered. That progression was instructive. It revealed the architecture of power and its limitations. Even kings discovered boundaries eventually. Even authority met things it could not simply bend. Poseidon, god of the sea, of earthquakes, of horses, a being of tremendous force, of passion that moved in waves and crashes. To make such a one rest would require understanding what rest meant to something that embodied constant motion. The sea itself never truly slept. It shifted, turned, rose and fell according to moon and wind. But there were moments between waves. Pauses in the crash and spray. Instants when the surface lay almost smooth, gathering itself before the next surge. Those moments were not weakness. They were necessary. Even violence required breath between blows. Hypnos watched the silverfish circle. They moved without hurry. Their route never changed, yet never became tedious. Round and round in paths worn smooth by repetition, finding comfort in the pattern rather than boredom. He wondered if Poseidon understood his own exhaustion. Gods were not always aware of their weariness. They carried power like armor, and sometimes forgot the weight. The Sea Lord fought for his mortal favorites with the intensity of personal investment. Did he notice how that caring drained him? Did he feel the slow accumulation of tiny decisions, small interventions, the weight of watching men die for causes they invented? Probably not. Awareness of fatigue often came too late. It arrived as collapse rather than warning. Hypnos reached into the water. The silver moved around his fingers without resistance. Cool but not cold, present but not insistent. He let his hand rest there, feeling the current move past. The fish adjusted their paths to accommodate his presence without acknowledgement. They simply flowed around the obstacle and continued. Making rest appealing required knowing what would appeal. Poseidon was not like Zeus. The king of gods valued control, order, the architecture of command. But Poseidon valued depth, mystery, the pull of currents that moved below surface understanding. The sea held secrets. It swallowed ships and kept their stories. It drowned cities and preserved their names in salt and silence. Poseidon understood that kind of keeping, that patient, relentless preservation. Sleep, Hypnos thought, could be offered that way, not as absence but as depth. Not as surrender, but as descent into something that held and protected. The ocean's floor was not empty. It was full of pressure, darkness, and the weight of all the water above pressing down in a blanket of absolute force. That was rest. That was the sleep the Sea Lord might understand and accept. Hypnos withdrew his hand from the water. The silver closed over where his fingers had been without leaving ripples. The fish continued their eternal circuit. Around him the cave breathed. Moisture collected on stone and released in slow drops that counted time without marking it. The poppies swayed to wind that came from nowhere. The grey light neither brightened nor dimmed. This was his domain, not bright like Olympus, not dramatic or demanding, but deep in the way wells were deep. In the way that forgetting was deep, in the way that rest, true rest, required descending into something that held you while you stopped holding yourself. He thought about his mother, Nyx, the night from which he came. She understood darkness, not as absence but as presence. The night was not empty space. It was full of stars, dreams, possibility, and the relief of not being seen. His brother Thanatos knew death the same way. Not as ending, but as arrival. The final shore after long swimming. They were old, these truths, older than Zeus's throne, older than the war that brought gods to power, older than the very concept of power as something to be grasped and held. Sleep predated ambition. It would outlast authority. When the last king fell and the final empire crumbled, sleep would still arrive each evening, patient and inevitable. Hypnos rose from the water's edge. His robes, dark and soft, moved without sound. He walked toward his bed but did not reach it. Instead, he paused, standing in the center of his domain, surrounded by the tools of his purpose: poppies, rivers, cushions, silence. He would help Zeus, not for loyalty or fear or obligation, but because the request, properly understood, aligned with something necessary. Poseidon needed rest whether he knew it or not. The sea needed its god to pause and remember depth, and Hypnos, being sleep itself, could not refuse genuine need even when poorly articulated. But he would do it his way, gently, with invitation rather than force. He would make consciousness feel heavy by reminding Poseidon what lightness felt like. He would make waking seem exhausting by showing rest as reprieve. The method would take time. Olympus would have to wait. Zeus would have to trust, or at least refrain from interfering. That would be the hardest part. Gods were not patient. They wanted immediate results, visible effects, proof that power had been properly applied. But sleep answered to different laws. It came when called only if the calling was sincere. It stayed only while welcome. It could not be commanded, hoarded, or distributed like spoils of war. These were limits. But limits were not weaknesses. They were definitions. boundaries that gave shape to purpose. Hypnos finally lay down on his cushioned bed. The softness received him without comment. He closed his eyes, though closing them changed nothing in the grey light. The darkness inside his lids matched the darkness outside them. He would rest first. Then he would find Poseidon. Then he would begin the slow work of making a god remember that even the sea grew tired of crashing. The poppies swayed. The silver fish circled. The cave held him in its ancient, patient embrace. And somewhere far above, on bright Olympus, Zeus waited for sleep to do what thunder could not. Rest, for Hypnos, was not an escape from consciousness. It was a different kind of awareness. A settling into the texture of existence without the need to shape or direct it. When he closed his eyes this time, he felt the boundaries of his domain expand and contract like breathing lungs. The decision had been made, not with thunder or proclamation, but with the quiet certainty of water finding its level. He would not simply lull Poseidon to sleep. That was crude work, the kind mortals imagined when they pictured gods wielding power like hammers. Instead, he would do something more dangerous, something that required him to leave the cave for the first time in longer than he could remember. He would descend into the sea itself. The ocean was Poseidon's realm, yes, but it was also a place where depth called to depth, where the weight of water pressed down with the same patient insistence as sleep, where currents moved according to laws older than naming. Hypnos had never needed to visit the domains of other gods. Sleep came to them all eventually, finding them in their beds or thrones or battlefields, but this was different. This required meeting the Sea Lord in his own element, understanding what held him awake. What made rest feel like defeat rather than reprieve? The cave seemed to understand before he spoke the intention aloud. The silver rivers began to flow more swiftly, though without sound. The fish adjusted their patterns, swimming now in spirals that suggested descent. The poppies bent their heavy heads as if bowing toward some distant depth. Hypnos stood. His robes shifted around him, fabric moving like dark water. He had no armor, no weapons, no symbols of authority. He carried only what he was, sleep itself, patient and persistent, wearing the shape of a god. The path opened before him, not a door or gate, but a thinning in the cave wall where stone became translucent, then transparent, then simply absent. Beyond it, darkness, but not the darkness of his domain. This was different, colder, heavier, salt-touched. He stepped through. The transition was not abrupt. The cave did not disappear behind him. Instead, it remained present in the way a dream remains present after waking, there but untouchable, visible but unreachable. He could still sense the poppies swaying, the moisture collecting and releasing, the fish completing their eternal circuits. But now he stood elsewhere. The ocean surrounded him without drowning him. Water moved past his skin but did not wet it. Pressure built around him but did not crush. He descended without falling, drawn downward by gravity that worked differently here, pulled not by weight but by depth itself. Light filtered down from above, green and shifting, growing dimmer with each moment. Schools of fish passed like silver thoughts, quick and purposeful. Kelp forests swayed in currents that sang songs without melody. The water held memory. Every drowned sailor, every lost cargo, every prayer thrown into waves and never answered. Poseidon's domain was not peaceful. It was restless with contained violence. Storms brewed in deep trenches. Earthquakes gestated in fault lines where stone ground against stone. The sea was beautiful, yes, but beautiful the way a sleeping lion was beautiful, dangerous even in repose. Hypnos continued downward. The light faded further. The water grew heavier, denser, until it felt less like liquid and more like time made tangible. Each moment pressed against him with the weight of centuries. He passed whale songs echoing through darkness, bioluminescent creatures drifting like stars that had fallen and forgotten how to rise. Coral cities built by tiny architects over generations, patient and persistent. The ocean floor approached. Not sand or mud, but ancient stone, the bones of the world before mountains learned to climb skyward. Here, in the deepest places, pressure transformed everything. Water became solid. Darkness became visible. Silence grew loud with its own absence. And there, in a palace built from what seemed like frozen storm, sat Poseidon. The Sea Lord did not turn when Hypnos arrived. He stared into a chasm that split the ocean floor, a wound in the earth that bled heat and minerals. His trident stood beside him, 3 prongs catching what little light penetrated this far down. Poseidon looked tired, not weary in body. Gods did not tire that way, but tired in the manner of something that had been moving for too long without purpose. Waves that crashed against shore because that was what waves did. Tides that pulled and pushed because stopping was unthinkable. Hypnos said nothing. He simply stood at a distance that suggested neither challenge nor submission, waiting the way water waits. Patient, inevitable. Finally Poseidon spoke. His voice rolled through the water like distant thunder. "Why have you come here?" It was not a question. Not truly, but Hypnos answered anyway. "You have forgotten what stillness feels like." The Sea Lord's jaw tightened. "I am the ocean. I do not still. I move, always. That is my nature. Even the deepest trenches hold moments of perfect calm." Hypnos moved closer, though not much. His dark robes flowed around him like ink dispersing through water. The pressure does not stop. The weight remains. But sometimes there is pause, not absence. Just depth without direction. Poseidon turned then. His eyes were the green-black of deep water at twilight. "You speak of sleep as if it were strength. It is surrender, letting go of control, allowing the world to continue without watching." Hypnos shook his head slowly. "Sleep is the deepest control. It is trusting that the world will hold its shape without your constant attention. The tide turns whether you command it or not. The currents flow according to laws you did not write. Sleep is knowing that and resting anyway." The Sea Lord's hand moved to his trident. For a moment tension gathered the way storms gathered on horizons, but then his fingers relaxed. The weapon remained untouched. "I cannot afford to rest." Poseidon's voice quieter now, more admission than argument. "Zeus schemes. Hera plots. The earth shifts beneath my waves. If I close my eyes, the balance tips." Hypnos moved to stand beside the Sea Lord, looking into the same chasm. "The balance tips regardless. That is its nature. You are not the fulcrum. You are the sea. Let yourself be what you are instead of what you fear you must be." Silence stretched between them. Around them, the ocean continued its ancient work, dissolving mountains grain by grain, wearing down continents with patient insistence, creating caves where none had been. Poseidon looked at Hypnos, truly looked, perhaps for the first time. "What did Zeus promise you?" "Nothing. I need nothing from him." "Then why come? Why help him manipulate me into vulnerability?" Hypnos met the Sea Lord's gaze without flinching. "Because I do not serve Zeus. I serve sleep, and you need rest whether his schemes require it or not. This is not manipulation. It is mercy." The word hung in the water between them. Mercy. A strange concept in the vocabulary of gods. They dealt in power, vengeance, glory, punishment. Mercy was too soft, too uncertain, too mortal. But here, in the deepest place, where pressure made everything honest, it felt like truth. Poseidon turned back to the chasm. "I do not know how to stop moving." "Then I will show you." Hypnos raised one hand. The water around them began to change, not temperature or current, but quality. It grew softer somehow, heavier in a way that felt like comfort rather than burden. like being held instead of trapped. The Sea Lord's breathing slowed. His shoulders, which had been rigid as coral, began to ease. His eyes, fixed on the chasm, started to drift closed. This is not weakness. Hypnos spoke gently, the way darkness spoke when it finally arrived after 2 bright days. This is depth. This is letting the pressure hold you instead of fighting it. This is remembering that even the ocean must rest in its own way. Poseidon's head lowered. His body relaxed against the stone throne. The trident fell quiet beside him. And in that moment, the decision completed itself. Not with drama or transformation, but with simple acceptance. The Sea Lord slept, not because he had been forced or tricked, but because he had been reminded. Rest was not defeat. Depth was not emptiness. Sleep was simply another way of being strong. Hypnos stepped back. The water around Poseidon settled into stillness. The currents adjusted their paths. The ocean continued, but softly now, respectfully, holding its god in the embrace that only depth could provide. The task was done. Zeus would have what he wanted, but more importantly, Poseidon would have what he needed. Hypnos began his ascent, rising through the layers of ocean toward the surface far above. The cave waited. The poppies swayed. The silver fish circled their eternal paths. And somewhere in the deepest trench, a god finally remembered how to rest. The ascent was different than the descent, lighter. The pressure that had surrounded him on the way down released slowly, layer by layer, like hands unclenching. Hypnos rose through green water that brightened as he climbed, past the kelp forests that swayed in rhythms they had learned millennia ago. Past the silver fish that scattered and reformed as though practicing the art of becoming one thing and then another. When he broke through the surface, the air was cool. The night had deepened while he was below. Stars crowded the sky in their usual profusion, and somewhere far off a bird called out, then fell silent again. Hypnos stood on the shore where the ocean met the land. His robes, which had remained dry even at the deepest point, moved slightly in the breeze. He did not hurry back to his cave. Instead, he waited. He knew someone was coming. She arrived without sound, which was her way. One moment the shore was empty except for him. The next, she was there, standing beside a cluster of rocks worn smooth by tide and time. Her presence did not announce itself with light or drama. It simply was. Pasithea, his wife. She wore pale robes that caught the starlight and held it softly. Her hair, dark as his own, fell in gentle waves past her shoulders. She was the youngest of the Graces, goddess of hallucination, of the visions that came in the space between waking and sleep, of the dreams that felt more real than memory. They had been married for longer than most mortals could count, yet they existed, as gods often did, in separate spaces more often than together. She wandered the twilight realms where imagination blurred into perception. He dwelled in the cave where sleep itself was born. But sometimes, like now, they found each other. How did it go? Her voice was soft, but not tentative. She knew him well enough to ask directly. Hypnos looked back at the ocean. The surface was calm. Beneath it, Poseidon slept in his throne of frozen storm, held by water that had finally learned to be gentle. He sleeps. Good. Pasithea moved closer, standing beside him at the water's edge. The waves lapped at the sand between them, regular as breathing. Zeus will be pleased. Zeus is always either pleased or furious. There is no middle ground with him. Hypnos turned to face her. But that is not why I went. I know. She smiled slightly. A expression that suggested understanding ran deeper than words could reach. You went because the Sea Lord needed rest, because you cannot bear to see anyone suffer from lack of sleep, even gods who have wronged you. He has not wronged me, no. But he could have. Any of them could. And you still offer what they need without requiring apology or acknowledgement. She reached out and touched his arm gently. That is both your strength and your danger. Hypnos considered this. Around them the night continued its slow work. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that repeated endlessly. The tide pulled at the shore, then released it, then pulled again. Somewhere inland, mortals slept in their beds, visited by dreams that Pasithea might have whispered into being. I met Hera. He said it quietly, as though the goddess might hear her name spoken even here, even now. Before I descended, she was waiting at the cave entrance. Pasithea's expression shifted slightly. What did she want? The same thing Zeus wanted. For Poseidon to sleep while they enacted whatever plan requires his absence. But she offered something Zeus did not. What? Protection. From him. From his anger when he discovers what I have done. Hypnos looked down at his hands. They were neither young nor old, neither strong nor weak. They simply were, the way sleep simply was. She said I would need it. She is not wrong. Pasithea moved in front of him, meeting his eyes directly. Zeus has a long memory for slights, and putting Poseidon to sleep, even at his own request, will feel like a slight when he wakes and discovers his brother's scheming. Hypnos shook his head. I told him I serve sleep, not Zeus. I told him the truth. Truth does not protect gods from consequence. You know this. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers cool and gentle. Why do you persist in believing honesty will shield you? Because, without it, sleep becomes something else. A weapon instead of a gift. A tool instead of a necessity. Hypnos covered her hand with his own. I cannot be what they want me to be. I can only be what I am. Pasithea was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. Her breath was warm. Her presence, always so ethereal when she walked through others' dreams, felt solid and real here. Then I will stand with you. When Zeus comes, when Poseidon wakes, when the consequences arrive, as they always do, she pulled back slightly to look at him. You do not have to face the weight of their expectations alone. Something in Hypnos's chest loosened. Not much, just enough. He had not realized until that moment how heavy the burden of isolation had become, how long it had been since someone stood beside him, not because they wanted something, but because they chose to. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. She smiled, and in her smile he saw the woman he had married, not the goddess of hallucinations or the youngest Grace. Just Pasithea, his wife. His companion in a world that often felt too bright and too loud for either of them. They stood together on the shore, watching the ocean settle into stillness. Somewhere beneath the surface, Poseidon dreamed whatever dreams sea gods dreamed. Currents flowed around his sleeping form. Fish swam past, unbothered by the presence of their lord at rest. Do you ever regret it? Pasithea asked after a while, being necessary. Being the one they come to when they need something only you can provide. Every day. Hypnos said it without hesitation. But I regret more the thought of a world where no one sleeps, where exhaustion builds until it breaks everything. Even gods need rest. Even you, especially me. He turned to her. I carry all their tiredness when I grant them sleep. I hold their dreams when you weave them. I stand in the space between consciousness and void and make sure they do not fall too far. It is heavy work. Then come home. She took his hand. The cave can wait. The poppies will not wilt if you rest beside me tonight. Hypnos looked back toward the mountains, where his cave waited in patient darkness. The entrance would be there, unchanged. The poppies would sway. The silverfish would circle. It had been that way for ages. It would remain that way for ages more. But tonight, perhaps, he could step away. Just for a while. He squeezed her hand gently. Take me wherever you go when you are not walking through dreams. She smiled, and the world shifted. Not dramatically, not with light or sound or transformation. It simply changed the way perception changed, slipping from one state to another without announcement. They were no longer on the shore. They stood instead in a grove of trees that grew in no mortal forest. The leaves overhead shimmered with colours that had no names. The air smelled of rain that had not yet fallen, and flowers that bloomed only in memory. This is where I rest. Pasithea led him to a place where the grass grew soft as silk. When the dreams become too heavy and the visions blur together, I come here and remember that I am not just what I do, I am also myself. Hypnos lay down beside her. The ground beneath him was gentle, supporting without demanding. Above them, the strange leaves rustled in a breeze that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, for the first time in longer than he could recall. Hypnos closed his eyes not to grant sleep to another, but to accept it for himself. Pasithea's hand found his in the grass between them. Her breathing slowed and steadied. Around them the grove hummed with quiet contentment. And somewhere far away, in a cave beneath a mountain, poppies swayed in darkness, patient and eternal, waiting for their keeper to return. Sleep came differently for gods. It did not arrive with the slow heaviness mortals knew, the gradual surrender of consciousness. For Hypnos, it was more like stepping through a doorway he had passed 1,000 times, but never truly entered. The threshold was familiar from the outside. From within, it was utterly unknown. He drifted in darkness that held no threat. Warmth surrounded him, not from any source of heat, but from presence itself. Pasithea's hand in his was an anchor, though he needed no anchoring. The grove hummed its wordless song. Time moved strangely here, or perhaps it did not move at all. And then memory rose like water filling a basin. He was younger. Not in appearance, for gods did not age in ways that showed on skin or bone, but in understanding. He had not yet learned to hold himself apart from those he served. He had not yet built the careful distance that kept other gods from consuming him entirely. The memory was of Olympus, the great halls where light fell in angles that defied geometry. Zeus had summoned him, not roughly, not with thunder or command. Simply a quiet word delivered by Hermes, who had appeared at the entrance to the cave with his usual irreverent grin. The king wants a word. Nothing dire. He probably just wants to discuss philosophy, or bore you with stories of his conquests, or both. Hermes had leaned against the cave entrance, careful not to disturb the poppies. You know how he gets after too much wine and not enough argument. Hypnos had gone because refusal was not truly an option. Not yet. Not in those earlier days when the order of things was still being established, and every god watched every other god for signs of disloyalty or ambition. He remembered climbing the mountain, the air growing thinner, the mortal world falling away below until it looked like something painted on a map rather than lived upon. Olympus rose through cloud and sunlight, its marble columns catching brilliance from a source that was not quite the sun. Zeus had been alone in the great hall. That itself was unusual. Typically, the king surrounded himself with advisors, supplicants, nymphs, or whichever brother he was currently not feuding with. But that day the hall stood empty save for Zeus himself, seated on his throne with a thoughtfulness that seemed almost mortal. Hypnos. The king's voice held none of its usual thunder. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to a seat. Hypnos took it, wary. Politeness from Zeus often preceded requests that were anything but polite. "I have been thinking about necessity." Zeus looked at him directly. "About which of us serves functions that cannot be replaced or reassigned? Poseidon could lose the sea tomorrow, and we would survive. Hades could abandon the dead, and they would simply wander. But you," he paused. "Without you, what happens? Everything breaks." Hypnos had answered honestly because he did not yet know that honesty could be used as a weapon. Mortals go mad first. Their minds fracture under exhaustion, then the animals, then the plants. Even gods begin to fray at the edges when rest is denied too long. Zeus nodded slowly. "That is what I thought." He rose from his throne, descended the steps. Up close, the king of gods looked tired. Not physically, but in some deeper way that transcended flesh. Do you know why I called you here? To ask something of me, to thank you. Zeus's expression was unreadable. Every god on this mountain wants something from you at some point. Sleep for themselves, sleep for their enemies. Sleep as gift or punishment or political tool, and you grant it without favoritism or agenda. You simply do what must be done. Hypnos had not known what to say to that. Gratitude from Zeus felt more dangerous than his anger. The king continued, I wanted you to know that I see it, the burden of being necessary, of having every god in creation believe they have a claim on your service simply because they exist and therefore require what you provide. He had turned then, walking to the edge of the hall where columns opened onto sky. Someday I will ask something of you, something you will not want to give, and when that day comes, you will remember this conversation and know that I do not ask lightly. Hypnos had felt the future weight of that promise settle across his shoulders like a cloak made of stone. What will you ask? Zeus did not turn around. I do not know yet, but it will come. These things always do. The memory dissolved slowly. Hypnos remained in the grove, lying beside Pasithea in grass that knew no seasons. Her breathing told him she slept deeply, peacefully. He did not wake her. That conversation had happened ages ago, long before Hera's requests, long before Poseidon's throne beneath the waves. Zeus had known even then what Hypnos would become to the other gods, a tool, a necessity, something to be used because it could not be replaced. And he had been right. The request had come eventually, not from Zeus himself, but through Hera, which was perhaps worse. Put my husband to sleep so I may undo his plans. Put the king to sleep so I may have my way. Hypnos had refused that first time. Hera had raged. She had threatened. She had offered bribes and made promises, and finally, when nothing else worked, she had wept. Not false tears meant to manipulate, but real grief for a marriage that had long ago curdled into something bitter and bound. He had still refused. Sleep was not a weapon to be wielded in domestic disputes, even divine ones. Not even for the Queen of Heaven. But she had returned. Again and again, each time with new arguments, new promises. And finally she had offered him Pasithea. Not as a bribe, though it could have been taken that way, as a gift. A companion who understood isolation, who lived in the spaces between waking and dreaming just as he did. Hypnos had not accepted because of Pasithea. He had accepted because he finally understood what Zeus had known all along. That necessity was its own trap. That being needed meant being used. And that refusing one request only meant facing another. He had put Zeus to sleep. Twice. Both times at Hera's behest. Both times knowing it would be remembered. The second time, Zeus had woken in fury. His rage had shaken Olympus itself. Hypnos had fled to his mother's arms, to Nyx, who stood between her son and the king's wrath. Even Zeus would not challenge night itself. But the memory remained. The debt, the betrayal, as Zeus surely saw it. Hypnos opened his eyes in the grove. Above him, leaves shimmered with their impossible colours. Beside him, Pasithea slept on. He did not disturb her peace. She had earned it. She had chosen to stand beside him knowing what storms would come. He had made his choices. Put gods to sleep who needed rest. Refused gods who wanted weapons. Built his cave in darkness where few would venture. Married a woman who understood silence. And now consequences gathered like clouds before rain. Zeus remembered. Poseidon would wake. The pattern would repeat because patterns always repeated. That was the nature of cycles. Beginning and ending flowing into each other like water into water. Hypnos did not regret his choices. But lying in that grove between sleeping and waking, he felt the weight of what those choices would demand, not just from him, from Pasithea, from anyone who chose to stand close enough to be caught in the storm. He closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to rest, to hold this moment before the next one arrived. The grove held him gently. The grass supported without question, and somewhere far away, in a cave beneath a mountain, poppies continued their endless swaying. Waiting, always waiting. Just as he would return to waiting when this moment passed, the cycle turned. It had always turned. It would turn again. Time stretched differently in the grove, or perhaps it did not exist at all. Hypnos lay in the grass that knew no seasons, eyes closed, aware of everything and nothing simultaneously. Beside him, Pasithea's breathing marked the only rhythm that mattered, the tide of her rest. He let his mind drift beyond the grove's boundaries. Not physically, he did not move, but awareness could travel where bodies could not, and he was, after all, the god of sleep. His domain extended wherever consciousness surrendered itself. He found a shepherd on a hillside in Arcadia. The man had been watching his flock for 3 days without pause. Fear kept him alert. Wolves had taken 2 lambs the week before, but exhaustion pressed against him like a physical weight. His eyelids fought their losing battle. Hypnos did not force him to sleep. He simply removed the barriers, the fear, the tension, the grinding insistence that rest was a luxury he could not afford. The shepherd sank into grass still warm from afternoon sun. His flock would be fine. The wolves would not come tonight. A woman in Athens paced her small room. Her child burned with fever. She had prayed to Apollo, to Asclepius, to any god who might listen. But prayer did not cool fevered skin or ease a mother's terror. She would not sleep while her daughter suffered. Hypnos touched the child instead, gently. A deep rest that would let small bodies fight their battles without the interference of pain. The fever would break or it would not. But the child would not suffer while the outcome remained uncertain. The mother, seeing her daughter's peaceful face, finally allowed herself to close her eyes. These were his true worshippers, not the ones who built temples or offered sacrifices, but every mortal who finally stopped fighting, who surrendered to the dark and trusted they would wake again. They did not know his name. They did not need to. A soldier lay dying on a beach far to the east, an arrow in his gut. The wound was mortal. He knew it. His companions had already moved on, chasing the enemy inland. He was 19. He would not see 20. Hypnos came to him as he had come to countless others, not with ceremony or announcement, simply as the release the dying always found. The soldier's pain faded first, then his fear, then his awareness of the blood-soaked sand beneath him. He drifted towards something darker and more complete than sleep. But the threshold was the same. Hypnos stood at every threshold, even that one. Back in the grove, his physical form remained still. Pasithea shifted slightly in her rest. Her hand found his without waking. Their fingers intertwined. Warmth met warmth. He was aware of both states at once, his body beside hers. His consciousness scattered across the mortal world like seeds. This was his nature. To be everywhere sleep was needed, to be nowhere anyone could point to and say, "There, that is where the god resides." The cave beneath the mountain was one anchor, the grove was another, but neither defined him. He was the moment eyelids grew too heavy. The instant thought unravelled into dream. The space between one breath and the next when waking ended. Mortals believed gods lived on Olympus because they needed to believe gods lived somewhere. That divine power resided in marble halls and golden thrones. Zeus encouraged this belief. It suited him. A king needed a throne room, but some gods were not made for thrones. Some existed in transitions, doorways, edges, places without fixed location. Hypnos opened his eyes in the grove and found the sky above had shifted, not dramatically. The colours remained soft, the light stayed gentle. But something had changed, time had passed. Or not passed. It was difficult to say with certainty. Pasithea still slept, her peace remained undisturbed. He was grateful for that. She had seen him fragment himself across the world before. She understood that while his body lay beside her, parts of him walked elsewhere. She had never asked him to be only one thing, only present in one place. That acceptance was its own kind of love. He thought of the soldier on the beach, the shepherd in Arcadia, the fevered child in Athens. Each had crossed the threshold he guarded. Each had trusted, consciously or not, that rest existed beyond their immediate suffering. They did not pray to him. They did not know his story. They did not care that he had angered Zeus or fled to his mother's protection or married a Grace who understood isolation. They simply needed what he provided, and he provided it. Not because they prayed, not because they deserved it, but because sleep was as necessary as breath, as inevitable as death, as democratic as darkness. Gods on Olympus demanded worship. Hypnos demanded nothing. He appeared in lives without announcement and departed without recognition. Anonymous, necessary. Everywhere and nowhere, the grove hummed its wordless song. The grass supported him without question. Above, leaves caught light that came from no specific sun. This place existed outside the usual rules. It was neither day nor night, neither waking nor sleeping. It simply was. Like him, Hypnos closed his eyes again. Not to sleep. Gods rarely needed what they provided, but to rest, to hold this moment between all the others, to feel Pasithea's hand in his and know that here, at least, he was not scattered. Here he was singular. The poppies in his cave would be swaying, their motion unceasing, their petals releasing the gentle dust that made mortals' eyes grow heavy. The river Lethe flowed somewhere beneath everything. Forgetfulness moved in currents mortals could not see but felt nonetheless. These were the mechanisms of his domain, the physical manifestations of something fundamentally immaterial. You could not build a temple to sleep, you could only surrender to it. Zeus had understood that, in his way. Every god on this mountain wants something from you. Sleep for themselves, sleep for their enemies. Even the king of gods could not command rest. He could threaten, demand, rage. But sleep came when it came, or it did not come at all. That was why Zeus had been polite during that long-ago conversation, because politeness was all he had. Force did not work on sleep, neither did divine authority. You could not decree yourself into rest. Hypnos had learned this truth long before that conversation, before his cave, before his marriage, perhaps before his own awareness solidified into what could be called consciousness. He was born from night itself. Darkness that existed before light gave it contrast, and night brought rest whether gods willed it or not. Pasithea's breathing shifted slightly, not waking, but dreaming. He could feel the change. Her mind wandering through landscapes only she could see. He did not follow. Her dreams were hers alone. The grove held them both. Warm darkness, eternal grass, leaves that shimmered with colours that had no names in any language mortals spoke. This place existed because they needed it to exist. Because even gods who served sleep required somewhere to lay their burden down. Hypnos breathed. In, out. The same rhythm as his wife. The same rhythm as the shepherd in Arcadia. The same rhythm as every living thing that paused between action and action to simply exist. The cycle turned, beginning and ending flowing into each other like water into water, like sleep into waking, like one breath into the next. He would return to his cave eventually. The poppies would still be swaying. Mortals would still need what he provided. Gods would still make their requests. The pattern would repeat, because patterns always repeated. But for now, in this moment between moments, he rested, whole, singular, present. The grove hummed, Pasithea dreamed, and somewhere, everywhere, mortals closed their eyes and trusted the darkness to hold them until morning. Pasithea woke some time later, or perhaps she had been awake for hours. Time moved strangely in the grove. She stirred beside him, her fingers tightening briefly around his before releasing. Not pulling away, simply adjusting, finding a new shape for their connection. She did not speak immediately. Neither did he. Words were not always necessary between them. They had learned that early. Language was a mortal tool, useful but limited. Sometimes silence carried more than sentences ever could. When she finally turned her head toward him, her eyes held that particular depth that came after true rest. Not the surface sleep that mortals often experienced, restless and shallow, but the kind that reached down into the core of being, the kind that restored rather than merely paused. "You were far away," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. "I was here," he replied. Both statements were true. She smiled, small, knowing. "You are always both places, present and absent, near and scattered." He thought about this, about how she understood without needing explanation. Most beings could not comprehend existing in multiple states simultaneously. They required singularity, definition, here or there, this or that. Pasithea had never demanded he choose. "Does it trouble you?" He asked. The question had been forming for centuries. He had never given it voice before. She considered. Her hand moved to the grass between them, fingers tracing patterns he could not quite discern. "Trouble is the wrong word. Sometimes I wonder what it feels like to be one thing in one place, to have edges that do not blur. You are a grace," he said. "You are already more than singular." "Yes." "But grace exists in presence, in the moment observed. When I bring beauty to a gathering, I am there, fully. You exist across thresholds. Everywhere sleep is needed, you respond, even when your body lies beside mine." The grove's hum shifted slightly, lower, softer, as if making room for their conversation. "Does that divide you?" she asked. Not the same question he had posed, but related, adjacent. Hypnos looked up at the leaves overhead. They caught light and held it, released it, a gentle rhythm that matched nothing and everything. "I am always divided," he said. "That is my nature, what I am, fragment and whole at once. The question is whether the division breaks me. Does it? No." He said it with certainty. "Because I return here, to this place, to you." The fragments remember they belong to something larger. Pasithea rolled onto her side, facing him fully. Her expression was calm but intent. "Tell me something," she said. "When you are elsewhere, when you bring sleep to the shepherd or the soldier or the child, do you feel them, their weariness?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." "Not as pain, more like recognition. I feel the shape of their exhaustion, the specific weight of whatever burden pressed them toward rest. Each is different. That must be heavy. It is what I am," he said. "I do not carry their burdens for them. I simply make space for them to set those burdens down. Briefly, until morning." She reached out, her hand finding his cheek. Her touch was light. "Barely there. And who makes space for you?" The question settled between them. He had no ready answer. Gods who served rarely considered their own need for service. That was not how divinity functioned. You existed to fulfill your purpose. The purpose sustained you. Except it did not entirely. Otherwise he would not need this grove, this grass that knew no seasons. This wife who understood fragmentation without fearing it. You do, he said finally. Simply, this place does. Pasithea's thumb moved gently across his jaw. I wondered if you knew that. Sometimes I think you give so freely because you do not recognize your own depletion. You appear where you are needed without considering whether you can sustain that appearance. Sleep cannot run out, he said. It is not finite. You are not sleep itself, she corrected. You are the God who governs it. Similar, but not identical. Gods can diminish. Even gods born from night. He had not thought of it that way. Or perhaps he had, but never allowed the thought to solidify. Gods did not speak of their limitations. To acknowledge weakness was to invite exploitation. Zeus had taught him that during their careful negotiation, show no vulnerability, offer no opening. But Pasithea was not Zeus, and this conversation was not negotiation. What would depletion look like, he asked. Curious now, genuinely uncertain. She lowered her hand, but kept her eyes on his. You would stop returning here. You would fragment so completely that no center remained. You would exist only in service. Only in response to need. The part of you that is Hypnos, singular and whole, would dissolve into the function you perform. The image disturbed him, not because it was terrifying, but because he could see how easily it might happen. How natural that dissolution would feel. One more mortal who needed rest. One more prayer answered. One more threshold crossed. Each time scattering himself a little further until the pieces forgot they had once formed a whole. I have not dissolved yet, he said. No, because you come back. Because I am here. Because this place exists. Because you call me home, he said, understanding now what she had been trying to tell him. She nodded. Someone must. Even gods who serve need tethering, need someone to remind them they are more than their function. You are not merely the one who brings sleep. You are Hypnos, husband, brother to death itself. You are allowed to exist beyond utility. The words settled into him, not changing anything, but clarifying. She had given him permission he had not known he was seeking. Permission to be present here, to rest without guilt, to hold her hand and simply breathe without fragmenting himself across the world in constant response. Thank you, he said. She smiled. You are welcome. Though you might thank me more enthusiastically tomorrow. Tomorrow? Your brothers are visiting, Thanatos and the others. They asked to meet in the grove, something about family gatherings being overdue. Hypnos blinked. Family gatherings. Children of Nyx rarely congregated. They were scattered by nature and function. Death walked his own path. The fates spun their threads in isolation. Gathering meant disruption, convergence of forces that normally operated independently. How many? He asked. Enough, Pasithea said. Her smile widened slightly. They miss you, even if they would never say so directly. He tried to imagine it. His brothers and sisters here in this grove. Death sitting in grass that knew no seasons. Perhaps the fates arguing over something minor while their threads tangled around their fingers. Charon complaining about river traffic. The image was both absurd and strangely appealing. Will the grove hold them? He asked. It holds what needs holding, Pasithea said. That is its nature. Like you. Above them, the leaves continued their shimmer. The hum remained steady, and somewhere beyond the grove, mortals slept. The pattern continued, but here, in this moment, Hypnos was simply present, preparing for a gathering he had not anticipated, held by a wife who understood that even gods needed calling home. The sky shifted again, still soft, still gentle, but different. Always different, always the same. Memory settles differently for gods. It does not arrange itself in neat chronological order, does not file itself away in labelled chambers. It exists all at once, layered and simultaneous, accessible from any angle if you know how to reach. Hypnos reached now. Not deliberately, not with intention. But Pasithea's words about his siblings stirred something beneath the surface of his awareness, a memory that was not quite memory, more like a pattern repeating itself across time. He had gathered with them before, long ago, before mortals built their cities, before heroes learned to call upon the gods for favors, back when the children of Nyx were still learning what they were meant to be. The memory unfolded slowly. Hypnos did not try to grasp it. He simply let it arrive. They had met in a different place then. Not this grove, a cavern deep beneath the earth where their mother's darkness pooled thickest. The space had no defined edges, no clear boundaries between floor and wall and ceiling. Just darkness that held them gently, that knew their shapes without needing to see them. Thanatos had been there, his twin. Always his twin. Death sat across from him, silent and observant, watching the others with eyes that saw too much. Even then, before mortals began their endless dying, Thanatos had carried that weight, that knowledge of endings. The Fates had been younger then, less certain of their authority. Clotho spun her thread with careful concentration. Lachesis measured with hands that sometimes trembled. Atropos held her shears, but rarely used them. They were still learning the rhythm of their work, still understanding that every thread they cut represented a life concluded. Charon had complained even then, about the river that was his to ferry, about the souls who would soon begin their crossing, about the thankless nature of his task. Some things never changed. Some complaints were eternal, and there were others. Eris, already stirring trouble with a smile. Nemesis, quiet and watchful, waiting for injustice to name itself. The Caries, those spirits of violent death, restless and hungry for the wars that had not yet begun. They had gathered because Nyx had called them. Their mother rarely summoned. She existed in her own realm, vast and undefinable. But occasionally she pulled her children together to remind them they were family, that their separate functions did not sever their connections. Hypnos remembered sitting in that darkness, feeling the presence of his siblings pressing against him, divine but uncertain, powerful but still learning. Thanatos had spoken first, his voice low, almost reluctant. "We will become what mortals need us to be," he said. "Our shapes will solidify around their understanding. Their fear will define me. Their exhaustion will define you." "Is that not always how gods function?" Nemesis had asked, her tone sharp, already taking shape around the concept of retribution. "Some gods choose their domains," Thanatos replied. "We were born into ours. We did not select sleep or death or fate. These things selected us." Clotho's thread paused in her fingers. "Does that make us less?" "Different," Hypnos had said, surprising himself by speaking. "Not less. Just different. Zeus claims the sky because he seized it. We embody our functions because we emerged already woven into them." "Convenient philosophy," Eris muttered, already stirring discord. But the others had considered his words, and in that consideration something had shifted. An acceptance. They were not diminished by being born into purpose. They simply were. Function and being merged so completely that separation became impossible. The memory rippled. Time moved strangely in recollection. Moments compressed or expanded depending on their weight. Later in that same gathering, after the conversation had fractured into smaller exchanges, Thanatos had approached him. "Twin finding twin in the darkness. You will struggle with it," Death had said. No preamble, no softening. With what being needed? "You are kind, kinder than most of us. When mortals call for sleep, you will answer, every time. Without hesitation. It will fragment you. Hypnos had not understood then. He was still young in his divinity, still learning the shape of his own purpose. Sleep is rest. How can offering rest be fragmenting? Thanatos had been quiet for a long moment. Then, because you will give it freely, without measuring cost, and mortals are infinite in their need, they will call and call and call, and you will answer, should I not? I am not saying you should refuse. I am saying you should understand what answering requires. I claim souls once, one ending per mortal. Final and complete, you visit them every night. Sometimes multiple times. Your presence is expected, required, endless. The weight of that observation had settled over Hypnos even then, before he had served his first mortal, before he understood exhaustion or depletion, or the strange dissolution that came from scattering himself too widely. What do you do? Hypnos had asked, to remain whole? Thanatos had smiled, rare and brief. I remember I am more than my function. I sit with our mother sometimes. I walk paths that lead nowhere. I exist without purpose occasionally. You should learn to do the same. But Hypnos had not learned. Not for a long time. He had thrown himself into his work with the enthusiasm of the young and divine. He had answered every call, visited every threshold, offered rest to anyone who needed it, and slowly, without noticing, he had begun to thin, to spread himself across so many places that his centre grew weak. It was only when he met Pasithea that he understood what Thanatos had tried to tell him. She had seen his fragmentation immediately, had recognized the danger of a god who served without boundary, and she had called him home, created this grove where he could gather himself, where the scattered pieces could reform into something singular and whole. The memory released him gently. He blinked. The grove reformed around him, the grass beneath his back, the leaves overhead catching light. Pasithea beside him watching with patient eyes. You were far away, she said. Remembering, he replied, when we gathered before. Long ago. What did you remember? He considered. Thanatos warning me. About fragmentation. I did not listen. You were young and foolish. Young and generous, she corrected. There is a difference. You gave freely because you saw need and responded. That is not foolish. It is who you are. You simply needed someone to help you remember you are allowed to stop occasionally. He reached for her hand, found it, held it gently. Tomorrow they will come, and I will be here, whole, present, because you taught me how. I did not teach you. I simply reminded you. The knowing was already there. Above them, something shifted. A bird, perhaps, or wind moving through branches. The grove adjusted itself, making space for the gathering to come, for the children of Nyx to converge once more. Hypnos felt anticipation stirring. Gentle but real. He had not seen his siblings in many turnings of the mortal world. They existed in parallel, serving their separate functions. Crossing paths rarely, but tomorrow they would sit together. Share presence if not words. Remember they were family before they were function. Will it be strange, he asked, having them here? Pasithea smiled. Everything divine is strange. This will simply be a different strangeness. Familiar rather than foreign. He closed his eyes. Let the hum of the grove settle into him. Let memory and anticipation blend into something peaceful. Tomorrow would bring his siblings. Tonight brought rest. And between those two moments lay this one, held gently, sufficient unto itself. The grass knew no seasons. The light continued its shimmer, and Hypnos, son of night, husband to grace, remained exactly where he needed to be. Night folded itself across the mortal world in waves. First, the eastern rim of the horizon. then the valleys, then the high places where daylight always lingered longest. Hypnos felt each fold as it settled, the collective exhale of a world preparing for rest. He opened his eyes. Pasithea had released his hand. She sat with her back against a tree now, watching the light change through the canopy. The grove did not follow mortal patterns exactly, but it responded to them, acknowledged them. When night came elsewhere, something shifted here as well. "They are calling already," he said. She nodded. She knew. Wives of gods learned to recognize the signs, the slight distance in his gaze, the way his attention fractured at the edges. "Will you answer?" Not yet. He remained on the grass, resisting the pull. It was stronger now than in the past. Centuries of service had woven pathways between himself and the mortal world, channels that opened automatically when need arose, like water finding familiar grooves in stone. The first calls came from children. Always children first, their needs simpler, more immediate. A mother singing, a father telling stories, warmth and darkness and small bodies growing heavy. Hypnos felt them at the edge of his awareness, waiting, trusting. He did not move. "You are testing yourself," Pasithea observed, "reminding myself that I can wait, that they will sleep without me if necessary." Will they? He considered. Honest appraisal required careful thought. Most will. Eventually. Sleep comes with or without divine intervention. I simply make the threshold easier to cross, smoother, less fraught with the mind's resistance. But some need you. Some need me. The second wave came harder. Adults now, soldiers on distant battlefields lying in mud and fear, sailors rocking on black water, farmers too exhausted to quiet their thoughts, grieving widows, anxious fathers, those whose minds had forgotten how to release the day. The pull intensified. Not painful exactly, but insistent. Like a rope tied around his center, drawing taut. Pasithea watched him. Did not interfere. This was his choice. His boundary to establish or dissolve. Thanatos was right, Hypnos said. His voice carried strain now. The need is infinite. If I answer every call, I will never stop moving, never be only here. Only whole. He usually is right. About such things. Does it make me cruel? To wait? To let them struggle? Does it make a river cruel when it does not flood every field that thirsts? He almost smiled. She had a way of reframing questions that made them answerable. Rivers have no choice in their flowing. Neither do you, not truly. You will answer. You always do. But you are learning to choose when. That is not cruelty. That is wisdom. The third wave arrived with weight. These were the desperate ones, those who had not slept in days, whose minds had begun to fray at the edges, who lay in darkness with wide eyes and racing hearts, begging for release. Some called his name. Most did not know names could help. They simply reached into the dark and hoped something would reach back. Hypnos felt himself beginning to dissolve. The familiar sensation of spreading thin, his consciousness wanting to fracture, to be in 1,000 places simultaneously, offering rest, easing thresholds, gentling the transition from waking to dreaming. He gripped the grass beneath him, anchoring. The blades were cool and real. They held him to this place, this moment, this singular existence. I cannot ignore them, he said. I know. But I cannot answer them all, not tonight. Not while trying to remain gathered for tomorrow. Then choose. Answer some. Let others find their own way across the threshold. Trust that sleep existed before you did, that mortals slept through all the ages when gods were still being born from night and chaos. It went against his nature. Every fibre of his being pulled toward service, toward answering, toward easing suffering wherever it appeared. But Pasithea was right. If he scattered himself tonight, there would be nothing whole to offer his siblings tomorrow. Nothing present, just fragments of a god stretched too thin across too many thresholds. He chose carefully, a child in Athens whose mother had died, who lay weeping into straw, a soldier in Sparta bleeding from wounds that would not heal, who needed darkness more than consciousness, an old woman in Thebes who had seen too many winters, whose eyes would not close without assistance. 3, only 3, out of thousands calling. He sent himself to them, not his whole self. Just enough, a presence at the edge of their awareness, a gentle pressure on eyelids, a softening of thought. He stayed with each one until their breathing deepened, until the threshold was crossed. Then he withdrew, back to the grove, back to his body on the grass, back to Pasithea waiting patiently beside him. The other calls continued, unanswered. He felt them like small wounds, each one a reminder of need he could not meet, of suffering he allowed to continue. This is the conflict, he said quietly, the one Thanatos warned me about, not between myself and others, between myself and my own nature, between what I am and what I can actually sustain. Yes, does it ever become easier? I do not know. You are the only god of sleep. There is no precedent, no older version of yourself to ask for guidance. He turned his head, looked at her. She met his gaze steadily, her presence solid, unwavering, the anchor he had needed without knowing to ask for one. Tomorrow they come, he said, my siblings. They will see this struggle. Thanatos already knows. But the others, they will see a god who cannot fully be present because part of him is always elsewhere, always answering calls, always serving. They will see family, Pasithea corrected. They will see a brother who learned boundaries too late, but learned them nonetheless. And they will sit with you anyway, not because you are perfect, because you are theirs. The grove darkened slightly, responding to the night beyond its boundaries. Stars appeared between leaves. Not real stars, perhaps, or perhaps more real than those visible to mortal eyes. It was difficult to know in places where time and space bent around divine presence. The calls diminished gradually, not because need lessened, but because most mortals eventually surrendered to exhaustion. Sleep came whether invited or not. The body had its own wisdom, its own methods of self-preservation. Hypnos felt the pressure ease, the rope around his center loosening. He could breathe more deeply, exist more fully in this single place, this single moment. I am afraid, he admitted, that tomorrow they will gather and I will dissolve anyway, that the habit of fragmentation is too deeply rooted, that I have forgotten how to simply be without serving. Pasithea lay back on the grass beside him. Their shoulders touched, warm and solid and immediate. Then we practice now, existing without purpose, being without function. You and I, here, doing nothing but breathing and watching stars that may or may not be real. He closed his eyes. Let the grove hold him. Let Pasithea's presence anchor him. Let the remaining calls fade to background noise, acknowledged but not answered, witnessed but not served. Tomorrow would test him. Tomorrow would reveal whether he could remain whole among family, whether the gathering would heal or fragment him further. But tonight he practiced the harder thing, the thing Thanatos had suggested long ago in that dark cavern beneath the earth. He existed without purpose, rested without serving, simply was, without becoming something for someone else. The grass continued its eternal growth. The light held steady, and somewhere beyond the grove's boundaries, Mortals slept or did not sleep, struggled or surrendered, called into darkness and received whatever answer the night itself chose to provide. He opened his eyes, found Pasithea watching him with something that might have been approval or relief or simple recognition. The stars between the leaves had multiplied, or perhaps his vision had changed. Perhaps he was finally seeing what had always been there. How long? He asked. Long enough. The eastern mortals are dreaming now. The western ones have just begun calling. The cycle continued, would always continue. He felt it turning like a great wheel somewhere beneath the surface of all things. Mortals woke and slept, called and surrendered, needed and released. The pattern older than memory, older than gods. I cannot stop the wheel, he said. No. I can only choose where I stand in relation to it. Yes. He sat up slowly. His body felt heavier than before, more substantial, as though refusing dissolution had given him weight. The grass beneath his palms was cool, real, anchoring. Pasithea remained lying beside him. Her gaze had shifted to the canopy overhead, following patterns only she could see. The light filtering through leaves painted her face in shades of silver and shadow. When they gather tomorrow, he said, they will bring their own natures with them. Thanatos will carry death. The Onoroi will trail dreams like silk scarves. Momus will wear mockery like a second skin. And I will still be answering calls even while sitting among them. Perhaps. You think I can stop entirely? I think stopping entirely would break you in a different way, but you can turn the volume lower. Acknowledge the calls without rushing to meet them. Let them be background instead of foreground. Trust that sleep will claim most mortals without your direct intervention. He considered this. The calls were still audible. A woman in Corinth pacing her room. A man in Delphi staring at ceiling beams. A child in Argos crying for water. Each need distinct, each suffering particular. But Pasithea was right. Most would eventually sleep regardless. The body had its own mechanisms, its own surrender protocols. Thanatos does not answer every death, Hypnos said slowly. No. Most mortals die without him present. Death still occurs. The threshold still gets crossed, yes. So sleep can happen without me, has happened without me, will continue happening whether I intervene or not, even saying it felt like heresy. His entire existence had been built around the opposite belief, that every mortal needed his touch, his guidance, his gentle pressure on tired eyelids. But it was a lie he had constructed to give himself purpose, to justify his own nature. I made myself necessary, he said, when I was never truly necessary at all. Pasithea turned her head, met his gaze directly. You are necessary, just not in the way you thought. Not as a servant answering every call, but as the embodiment of something mortals need to believe exists. The possibility of rest, the promise that consciousness can be released. You do not cause sleep, you represent it. Remind mortals it exists, that it is safe to let go. The distinction mattered. He felt it settle into place like a bone finding its proper socket. He was not the maker of sleep. He was its face, its symbol, its divine guarantee that darkness could be trusted. Then tomorrow, he said, I sit with my siblings as that symbol. Present, whole, not scattered across 10,000 bedrooms trying to ease 10,000 brows. If you can, if I can. The grove had fully darkened now. Only the impossible light remained. Constant, unchanging. A luminosity that had nothing to do with sun or moon or stars. The grass continued growing. The trees continued their slow breathing. Everything here existed in a state of eternal continuation. No true night, no true day. Just this steady presence that never quite became either. Hypnos lay back down, shoulder against Pasithea's shoulder, sky overhead filled with stars that might be memories or promises, or simply light that had forgotten its source. The calls continued their distant humming, background music to existence. He thought about the gathering, his siblings arriving one by one. Thanatos first, probably, always punctual. The Oneiroi drifting in like smoke, Momus making some comment about the grove's aesthetic choices. Others he had not seen in ages, all of them children of Nyx. All of them embodiments of necessary things. Sleep, death, dreams, blame, strife, pain, doom. A strange family, not warm perhaps, but honest, each one exactly what they were. No pretense, no performance. Just divine function made manifest. I have not been honest, he said quietly. With them or myself, I performed competence, pretended wholeness, while fragmenting silently behind the scenes. And tomorrow you will sit with them and admit otherwise. Yes. That is the resolution then, not fixing yourself, not becoming whole through effort, but admitting brokenness, letting them see the cracks. He had not thought of it that way. Resolution implied completion, fixing, a problem solved. But perhaps resolution could also mean acceptance, acknowledgement, the end of pretending things were other than they were. I have been scattered for so long, he said, I do not know if I remember what wholeness feels like. Then tomorrow you will find out, or you will not. But either way, you will be sitting among family who chose to gather, who wanted your presence enough to leave their own realms. That matters more than whether you remain perfectly focused. The calls had diminished to a murmur now. Most mortals had surrendered, found whatever rest their bodies could manufacture. A few stubborn ones remained wakeful, staring into darkness, counting ceiling beams, fighting the inevitable. He felt them like distant candle flames, flickering but persistent. He did not answer, did not send himself to their bedsides. Simply acknowledged their existence, witnessed their struggle, trusted that exhaustion would claim them eventually, that their bodies knew how to sleep even when their minds refused. The release felt strange, foreign. Like putting down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it was optional. His shoulders settled deeper into grass. His breathing slowed. The tension that had lived in his chest for longer than he could remember began loosening. This is what mortals feel, he said suddenly, when they finally let go. When they stop fighting and surrender to what their bodies have been asking for. Yes, I have given them this feeling for eons, but never experienced it myself. Pasithea said nothing. Her silence was agreement enough. Hypnos closed his eyes. Let the grove hold him. Let the grass support his weight. Let the impossible light continue its steady glow without his observation. Tomorrow would come regardless. His siblings would gather regardless. The wheel of sleep and waking would turn regardless. Tonight he practiced the lesson mortals learned every sunset. How to let go, how to trust darkness, how to exist without purpose or function or service, how to simply be without becoming anything for anyone. The stars wheeled overhead, the grass grew, and somewhere in the distance the last few wakeful mortals finally surrendered. Their breathing deepened. Their thoughts scattered. Sleep claimed them not because a god intervened, but because the body had its own wisdom, its own knowledge of when consciousness had become too heavy to carry. Hypnos heard them fall silent one by one, the last candle flames extinguishing, and for the first time in longer than memory he was not called to answer, was not pulled toward service, could remain here in this moment whole and gathered and present. Tomorrow would test whether this could last, whether he could maintain form among family. But tonight resolution arrived not as triumph or completion, but as this: lying on grass that never stopped growing, watching stars that might be real, practicing the art of existing without dissolving. The grove held him, Pasithea breathed beside him, and the great wheel of sleep and waking turned without his assistance, ancient and unstoppable and profoundly indifferent to whether any god watched its rotation. Morning arrived without announcement, no herald, no fanfare, just the same impossible light growing marginally brighter, though whether it came from sun or moon or something else entirely remained unclear. The grove did not care for mortal distinctions between dawn and dusk. It existed in its own time. Hypnos woke without having realized he slept. One moment he lay watching stars. The next, his eyes opened to find the canopy overhead unchanged, Pasithea still beside him, grass still growing beneath them both. The wheel had turned. Night had passed, and he had remained present through all of it. His body felt different, solid, weighted, as though sleep had given him substance rather than scattering him across 1,000 mortal dreams. He sat up slowly, tested his hands. They remained visible, tangible, real enough to press into earth and leave impressions. They will begin arriving soon, Pasithea said. She had not moved. Perhaps she had not slept. Perhaps she never did. Within the hour, probably. He nodded, stood, walked to the edge of the grove where trees gave way to open meadow. Beyond lay the wider world. Mountains in the distance, valleys he could not quite see, rivers threading through landscape like silver veins. Somewhere out there his siblings were preparing, gathering their forms, choosing which aspects of themselves to present. The thought unsettled him, not fear exactly, but awareness of what he had promised, to sit among them and admit fragmentation, to show the cracks he had spent eons concealing, to stop performing and simply exist as he was. I do not know how to do this, he said. Pasithea rose, joined him at the grove's edge. You showed me. Last night. That is how. Showing you was different. You already knew. You have always seen through divine performances, and your siblings have performed their own exhaustions, their own fragmentations. They will recognize yours. He was not convinced. His family had always been precise, exact, each one a perfect embodiment of their function. Thanatos brought death with neither hesitation nor error. The Oneroi wove dreams without question. Momas criticized with perfect accuracy. They did not scatter, did not dissolve, did not spend centuries pretending wholeness while secretly breaking. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps that was another assumption he had made, another story he had told himself to justify isolation. Behind them the grove began to shift. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle rearranging. Trees growing slightly taller, grass thickening beneath them, flowers opening that had not existed moments before. The space was preparing, making room for visitors who would soon arrive. Will you tell them everything? Pasithea asked. I do not know what everything means anymore. The Zeus incidents, the scattered consciousness, the centuries of answering every call because I believed I had to. Where does everything begin? Where does it end? Then tell them what matters. That you have been breaking quietly, that you need them to see you as you are rather than as you appear. Simple words, impossible practice. The first arrival came sooner than expected, not Thanatos, not the Oneroi, but Nemesis, goddess of retribution, who walked into the grove with her usual precision. She looked at Hypnos, then at the prepared space, then back at him. You look terrible, she said. It was almost comforting. Nemesis never softened truth. I feel terrible, he replied. She nodded, accepted this, moved past him to claim a spot beneath the largest tree. Good. I was worried you would perform happiness. That would have been exhausting to witness. Others followed. Momus arrived with commentary about the grove's layout. Too symmetrical, he claimed. Not enough chaos. Pasithea ignored him. The Oneroi drifted in without announcement. Morpheus, Phobetor, Phantasos. 3 of his sons who had long ago claimed independence from his influence. They nodded acknowledgement. Found places to settle. Thanatos came last. Always punctual, always measured. He looked at Hypnos for a long moment before speaking. Brother, he said. Nothing more, just that word. Acknowledgement without judgment. Hypnos had prepared speeches, explanations, ways to frame his confession that would minimize its impact. But standing here with his siblings gathered, watching them claim space in Pasithea's grove, all words fled. He was left only with truth. I have not been well, he said finally, for longer than I care to measure. No one interrupted. They simply waited. Let him find his way. I scattered myself, answered every call, made myself necessary when I was not. The Zeus incidents, they began the pattern, but I continued it long after. I believed I was required. That sleep could not happen without my presence. That withdrawal meant failure. Morpheus shifted slightly. We all felt it. Your absence and your presence both. You were everywhere and nowhere. Yes. Did you think we would judge you for that? Hypnos had no answer. He supposed he had. Or feared judgment enough that assumption became reality. Nemesis spoke from her place beneath the tree. Every god performs, presents their function as effortless. Natural. We are retribution. We are sleep. We are dreams. As though embodying cosmic principles requires no effort or strain, as though we simply are what mortals need us to be. Is that not our purpose? Hypnos asked. Our purpose is existence. Function is what mortals assign afterward. You confuse the two, made function into identity. Forgot that beneath the role lay something else. Momus made a noise of agreement. I have been blame and mockery for so long I barely remember what came before, if anything came before. Perhaps I was born criticizing. That seems exhausting in retrospect. Laughter rippled through the gathering, quiet. Brief, but genuine. Hypnos felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he had not known he carried. I need to learn how to exist without always serving, he said, how to witness sleep rather than command it, how to be symbol rather than maker. Thanatos stood, walked to where Hypnos remained at the grove's edge. Then we teach you, as family does, not by fixing you, but by witnessing your breaking without turning away. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they brought fresh awareness of how much breaking remained, how many fractured pieces still scattered across the world, how long the practice of gathering would take. But looking at his siblings, gathered in Pasithea's eternal grove, Hypnos recognized something important. He did not have to complete this alone, did not have to perform recovery, could simply sit among those who already knew what it meant to carry cosmic function until it became too heavy to lift. The gathering continued through what might have been afternoon. Time moved strangely in the grove. They spoke of their own exhaustions. Nemesis described the weight of perfect justice. Momus admitted that criticism without affection had grown hollow. The Oneroi confessed to occasionally forgetting which dreams were theirs and which belonged to mortals. Hypnos listened more than spoke. Let their admissions wash over him like cool water, recognized in each confession an echo of his own struggle. They were not perfect embodiments. They were gods who carried roles that sometimes weighed more than divine shoulders could bear. As evening approached, if evening existed here, the gathering began to disperse, not all at once. gradually, each sibling offering brief acknowledgement before departing. Nemesis touched his shoulder in passing. The Onoroi drifted away like smoke. Momus paused to criticize his posture before leaving with something that might have been concern in his eyes. Thanatos remained longest. He and Hypnos stood together at the grove's edge, watching the others fade. "This will not be quick," Thanatos said. "Learning to exist differently. You have spent eons in one pattern. Breaking it requires time, I know. But you are not alone in the breaking. Remember that when it feels impossible." Then he too departed, death following its own path, leaving Hypnos and Pasithea alone once more in the eternal twilight. Hypnos turned back toward the grove, toward the grass that never stopped growing, toward the tree that had sheltered his family's confessions. Tomorrow the calls would return. Mortals would need sleep. The wheel would turn. But tonight he had sat among siblings and shown them his cracks, had stopped performing wholeness, had begun the practice of simple being. It was not resolution, not yet. But it was something, a beginning of ending of beginning again. The cycle turning not toward completion, but toward honest continuation. Pasithea moved through the grove like water finding new paths. She did not speak immediately, simply existed beside him as the last traces of family presence faded into twilight. Her hand found his. The touch grounded him in a way words could not. "They will return," she said eventually. "Not all at once, not in patterns you can predict. But they will come again, I know. You needed to see that you were not performing for them, that they already knew." He had needed that more than he realized. The weight of pretending wholeness had been its own exhaustion. Showing cracks felt dangerous until it happened. Then it simply felt true. They walked together through grass that had been crushed by divine weight. Already it was rising again, memory of pressure fading as blades straightened. The grove held impressions briefly, then released them. Nothing stayed broken here. Not grass, not gods, only transformed. "What happens now?" Hypnos asked. "You continue. The work does not end, it simply changes shape." He understood that, had known it before the question left his mouth. But understanding and accepting remained different territories. One was intellectual. The other required bones and breath. They reached the grove's far edge where trees thinned and meadow opened beyond. The view stretched toward distant mountains. Silver rivers wound through valleys that had no names. Mortals never reached this place. It existed outside their geography. A pocket of divine space where functions rested between manifestations. "I answered calls today," Pasithea said, "while you gathered with family. 3 mortals who needed rest deeper than ordinary sleep. I went to them, spoke the words, loosened their grip on waking." Hypnos turned to look at her. "You did not mention this. You were occupied." The work continued regardless. She met his gaze without reproach. "It will always continue. Sleep does not pause when its god falters. The function remains even when the vessel cracks. Then what am I for? Witness, symbol, reminder that rest is sacred enough to require divine attention. You are not the maker of sleep. You are its embodiment, its representative. The difference matters. He had confused those roles for eons, made himself indispensable when he was meant to be symbolic. Presence mattered, but not in the way he had imagined, not through constant intervention, through existing as proof that even gods required rest. They stood at the edge, watching light shift across distant peaks. The impossible brightness that filled the grove dimmed slightly, not true darkness. Never that, but softening. Preparation for whatever passed as night in this timeless space. "I want to visit them," Hypnos said. "The mortals who called today. not to intervene, simply to witness. Pasithea nodded. Then go. I will remain here. The grove does not require both of us. He hesitated. Leaving felt strange after spending so long scattered across every threshold, but she was right. The grove would hold, she would tend it. His absence would not break anything that mattered. The first mortal lived in a coastal village where waves struck stone with rhythmic persistence. An old woman whose body had forgotten how to release consciousness. Pain kept her tethered to waking. Fear that sleep meant something worse than exhaustion. Hypnos stood at her bedside. Invisible, unnecessary, simply present. Pasithea's work was already complete. The woman's breathing had deepened, her grip on sheets loosened. She drifted into rest so profound that dreams could not reach her, pure absence. The sleep of stones and deep water. He did not intervene, did not add his power to what was already sufficient, simply watched, bore witness to the grace of letting go. When he departed, the woman slept on. His presence had changed nothing. That felt right. The second mortal was a child in a city of narrow streets and too many voices, overstimulated. Wound tight with the energy of youth meeting world's demands, she had cried for hours. Exhausted herself into a state beyond sleep, trapped in that terrible space where tiredness prevented rest. Again Pasithea's touch lingered. The child breathed easier. Her small fists unclenched, she rolled onto her side and settled into darkness so complete it held no dreams, no thoughts, only the absence necessary for tomorrow's existence. Hypnos stood by the window, let moonlight fall across his shoulders. He was not needed here, the work was done. Sleep had come without his command, but being present still mattered. Some difference too subtle for words. The third mortal was a soldier far from home. Too many memories, too much adrenaline. His body refused surrender even when exhausted beyond measure. He lay rigid in darkness, listening to his own heartbeat, counting breaths, failing at the very rest he desperately required. This one Pasithea had struggled with. Her influence remained but thinly. The soldier fought against sleep as though it were enemy rather than mercy. Old habits, old fears, the belief that vulnerability meant danger. Hypnos moved closer, not to interfere, to understand. He could feel the man's resistance. The way consciousness clung to waking like fingers gripping cliff edges, every muscle tight, every nerve firing. Sleep hovered near but could not land. He wanted to help, reached toward the soldier's awareness. Stopped. This was not his role. Not anymore. He could force sleep, pour divine power into mortal exhaustion until resistance crumbled, but that would be intervention. Not witness, not symbol. The old pattern dressed in new intention. Instead, he simply sat, remained present without acting. Let his existence as sleep's embodiment fill the space without demanding anything. The soldier continued struggling. His breathing stayed shallow. Consciousness held on with desperate strength. Hypnos waited, did nothing, was simply there. Eventually, slowly, the soldier's grip began to loosen, not from divine intervention, from exhaustion finally outweighing fear. His breathing deepened. Muscles released their tension degree by careful degree. Sleep came not as gift or command, as inevitable surrender to body's requirement. Hypnos watched him drift into darkness, felt no triumph, no satisfaction of function fulfilled, only quiet acknowledgement that sleep happened with or without divine attention. His presence had not caused this, had not prevented it, had simply been. He returned to the grove as false dawn touched distant mountains. Pasithea waited where he had left her. She looked at him with knowing eyes, asked no questions, simply opened her arms. He went to her. Let himself be held without explaining. No words existed for what he had learned. Only the feeling of standing beside sleep's occurrence rather than commanding its arrival. It continues, she said into his shoulder. Tomorrow, the day after, for all the days that follow, the calls will come. You will answer or not answer. Sleep will happen regardless. Your work is learning to be present without needing to control the outcome. That seems impossible. Most worthwhile things do, at first. They stood together as the grove's light shifted from twilight toward something approximating morning. Time moved in its strange way here, looping back, beginning again. The wheel turning without end. Somewhere mortals woke. Somewhere others slept. The rhythm continued as it always had, as it always would. Hypnos existed within that cycle, symbol of its necessity, reminder of its sacredness. Not maker, not master, simply witness to the endless requirement that consciousness must sometimes cease. He thought of his siblings, their admissions, their own struggles with divine function. They would return to the grove. Eventually, in their own time, the pattern would repeat. Not identical, never that, but similar enough to recognize. Tomorrow he would wake again in grass that held his weight, would watch light brighten from impossible sources, would hear calls if they came or sit in silence if they did not. The work would continue, the breaking would continue. The practice of existing without performing would stretch forward into forever. But tonight he stood with Pasithea. Let the grove hold them both. Accepted that resolution was not destination, only direction, the cycle turning not toward completion, but toward honest continuation. Always beginning, always ending, always beginning again. Days folded into one another without clear separation. Morning became, evening became morning, again in the grove's eternal half-light. Hypnos woke, rose, stood at the meadow's edge, looking toward mountains that never changed their distance. He could feel the rhythm now, the world's constant pulse of waking and sleeping, millions of small surrenders happening in the same moment, each one necessary, each one inevitable. He no longer counted the calls he received. Some mornings they came in waves. Other mornings brought silence. The pattern held no logic, required none. Sleep came when bodies demanded it, when minds could bear consciousness no longer. His presence beside these moments changed nothing about their occurrence. But something had shifted in him. Recognition, perhaps. Acceptance of what he had always been beneath the performance. A merchant in Athens struggled to rest. Debts mounting, family depending on him. Mind spinning through calculations and worries until exhaustion became a kind of torture. Hypnos stood in the room's corner, watched the man toss and turn, did not reach out, did not intervene, simply existed there as symbol of what the merchant needed but could not grasp. The hours stretched. The merchant's breathing remained shallow, eyes opening and closing without success. Hypnos felt the familiar urge to act, to pour sleep over this suffering like water over flame. But he remained still, present without power, witness without solution. Eventually the merchant's body took what his mind refused to grant. Sleep arrived not gently but suddenly, a collapse rather than descent. The man fell into darkness with a sound like prayer. Hypnos stayed until breathing deepened, until tension left shoulders and jaw. Then he left as quietly as he had come. In Corinth the mother sang lullabies to an infant who would not settle. The baby's cries filled small rooms. Neighbors knocked on walls. The mother's voice cracked from hours of singing. Her arms trembled from rocking. She looked near collapse herself. Hypnos appeared beside them both. The infant sensed something, grew quiet for a moment, looked toward where he stood with eyes too young to focus properly. The mother sang on, her voice barely more than whisper now. He could grant sleep to both of them instantly. The infant would drift, the mother would follow. Simple enough, merciful even. But that would be the old way, the pattern of command rather than witness. So he stood without acting, let his presence fill the space without demands. The infant eventually tired itself into sleep. The mother followed minutes later, slumped in her chair, still holding the child, both breathing in time. Both surrendered. He left them as dawn touched window frames. In Sparta, a warrior prepared for battle the next morning. He lay on his back staring at ceiling beams. Knew he should sleep, knew rest would serve him better than this anxious vigilance. But could not release consciousness into vulnerability, not with death waiting at sunrise. Hypnos sat beside him through the long night, said nothing, did nothing. The warrior never slept, never truly rested. Hypnos remained anyway. Being present mattered even when outcome could not change, perhaps especially then. The work began to feel less like breaking and more like transformation, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady as seasons. He was learning to exist without needing to control, to be symbol rather than enforcer, to trust that sleep would come whether he willed it or not. His role was remembrance, reminder of rest's sacredness, the acknowledgement that consciousness must sometimes cease for life to continue. Pasithea watched this change without comment. She saw how he moved differently now. Less urgency in his gestures, less desperation in his purpose. He was becoming what he had always been beneath the layers of divine expectation, not controller of sleep, not commander of rest, but its embodiment, its witness, its quiet acknowledgement. One morning he woke in the grove and felt it clearly, the shift complete at last. He was no longer God trying to learn gentleness. He was gentleness itself. The space between waking and dreaming, the threshold where consciousness released its grip. Not because he forced it, because nature demanded rest and bodies eventually surrendered. He stood in the meadow as light brightened from sources that held no logic. The mountains remained distant. The rivers wound through valleys unchanged, but something in him had risen. Not triumph, not achievement in the mortal sense, but ascension toward truth, toward honest function, toward being what he was rather than what he thought he should be. A call came. Child in Rhodes, nightmares keeping her awake past endurance. Hypnos went without hesitation, stood beside her bed as she whimpered in half-sleep. Did not touch her mind, did not force the nightmares away. Simply remained present, symbol of safety. Reminder that sleep existed even when darkness held terrors. She settled gradually. Her breathing steadied. Dreams shifted from nightmare to something gentler. Not from his intervention, from exhaustion outlasting fear. He watched until she rested peacefully, then returned to the grove. Pasithea waited where she always did. He went to her without speaking. She touched his face with hands that knew every part of him. "You understand now," she said. Not question, statement. "I understand enough. That is all anyone can claim." They sat together where grass held their weight. Time moved in its circle, beginning and ending and beginning again. The pattern eternal. Not punishment, not prison. Simply truth. Sleep would always be needed. Rest would always be required, and he would always be there. Not as commander, not as enforcer, but as witness to the sacred necessity of surrender. Somewhere mortals woke. Somewhere others drifted toward rest. The rhythm continued unbroken. He existed within that rhythm now, no longer fighting it, no longer trying to control what needed only acknowledgement. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more struggles, more moments where consciousness clung desperately to waking. He would answer or not answer, be present or remain in the grove. Sleep would happen regardless. His work was simply being what he was. The space where exhaustion became rest, where waking became dreaming, where the world remembered to stop. The grove's light shifted from morning towards something approaching afternoon, though such distinctions held little meaning here. Pasithea's hand found his. They sat together in timeless present, not waiting for anything, not hoping for change, simply existing in the truth they had both learned. That divinity was not power over function, but honest acceptance of what one embodied. Hypnos closed his eyes, let the grove hold him, felt the world's constant rhythm of sleeping and waking pulse through everything. He was part of that rhythm now, not its master, not its creator, but its living symbol, its gentle reminder, its eternal witness to the mercy of rest. Pasithea's fingers traced patterns on his palm, small circles repeated endlessly. The gesture held no urgency, no destination. Simply touch existing because touch existed. You are different, she said after time had passed unmeasured. I am less, you are more. He opened his eyes. The grove's light had not changed, would not change, but he saw it differently now, not as prison or gift, as truth. This was where he belonged, where he had always belonged. The threshold itself made manifest in poplar trees and impossible geography. I thought divinity meant power, he said. It does, not the kind I imagined. No, not that kind. She leaned against him, her weight familiar as breathing. They had sat this way countless times, would sit this way countless more. The repetition did not diminish meaning, perhaps enhanced it. Each moment both first and thousandth. Do you remember, Pasithea said, when you first came to me, I remember thinking I could fix everything. You were young, I was arrogant. That too. Quiet settled between them. Not uncomfortable, not empty. Full of everything neither needed to speak. Years of understanding compressed into stillness, into hands joined and breath synchronized. A shepherd in Thrace called out in exhaustion. Hypnos felt it, the familiar tug. The summons his nature could not fully ignore, but he did not rise. Not yet. The shepherd would sleep or wouldn't. His presence might comfort or might be unnecessary. Sleep operated by laws older than gods. You do not go, Pasithea observed. I go when needed. How do you know what is needed? I don't. Not always, she smiled. The expression carried satisfaction without smugness, that is, wisdom. The shepherd's call faded. Distance or resolution, impossible to know. Hypnos remained in the grove, grass beneath them. Sky above that held neither sun nor stars, the world both specific and abstract. Real and metaphor merged until distinction ceased mattering. I used to fear this, he said. The repetition, the unchanging nature of what I am. And now? Now I understand it is not repetition. Each moment is itself, each sleep unique, even as all sleeps remain sleep. Pasithea's hand tightened briefly. Release followed immediately. You sound like your mother. Nyx understands patterns better than anyone. She understands darkness. You understand rest. Different knowledge. Related, though. Related. They fell silent again. The grove's rivers made no sound. The wind moved through branches without rustling, everything suspended in perpetual almost. Not frozen, not stilled. Simply existing in its own time that held no relation to the hours mortals counted. A farmer's wife in Corinth finally surrendered to exhaustion. Hypnos felt her consciousness slip, watched from nowhere and everywhere as her body released tension it had held for days. She slept deeply, dreamlessly. The blessed emptiness of complete rest. He had not gone to her, had not touched her mind. She had simply fallen because falling was inevitable. There, he said, you felt it, you felt it. I always feel it, but you do not need to cause it. No, not any more. Pasithea shifted, her head rested against his shoulder. They fit together as they always had, as they always would. The bond between them, not something built, but something discovered, recognized rather than created. Do you regret, she asked, not having what others have? Zeus changes everything he touches. Athena shapes wisdom across generations. Apollo brings music and plague with equal power. I bring sleep. You are sleep. Yes. Is it enough? He considered. The question deserved honesty. Deserved time. Around them the grove held its breath, waiting without expectation. It is everything, he said finally. Not because it is grand, because it is necessary. Every living thing requires rest. Every consciousness needs cessation. I am that gift, that mercy, that brief death that allows life to continue. You say it differently now. I understand it differently. When did that change? He thought back, tried to locate the moment. Found only gradual shift, like seasons turning. No single day marked winter's arrival, simply accumulation of cold until suddenly snow-covered ground. When I stopped trying, he said, when I accepted that sleep would happen whether I willed it or not. My role is acknowledgement, witness. The reminder that rest exists when exhaustion becomes unbearable. Pasithea lifted her head, met his eyes. Hers held depths he had known for eternity, yet never fully understood. Perhaps never would. Perhaps that was proper. Some mysteries remain mysteries even to gods. I am proud of you, she said. The words landed softly, like snow on water. No weight, yet complete presence. I have done nothing. You have done everything. You became yourself. In Delos, a mother sang her infant toward sleep. The child fought. Wanted the world too much to surrender consciousness. The mother's voice cracked with fatigue. Hypnos went to them without deciding to go, simply appeared because appearance was natural. He stood in the corner where lamplight failed, said nothing. Did nothing. The mother never saw him. The child never knew, but presence mattered. The infant's eyes finally closed, small fists unclenched. Breathing steadied into sleep's rhythm. The mother wept with relief and exhaustion. Moments later she slept too, still holding her child. Both surrendered to what could not be fought forever. Hypnos returned to the grove, to Pasithea waiting, to the endless afternoon that might be morning, that might be evening, to the place outside time where time's purpose lived. This is the work, he said. This has always been the work. I know that now. She stood, drew him up with her. They walked together toward the meadow's edge where grass met something that might be forest, might be mountain, might be the border between dream and waking-made geography. Their steps matched without effort, their breathing synchronized without thought. Looking at this myth now, from the distance of countless sleeps and infinite waking, what does it teach? Not power over others, not domination of function, but acceptance of purpose, understanding that some things exist not to be commanded, but to be honored. Sleep remains sacred not because any god declares it so, but because every living thing recognizes its necessity. Hypnos embodies that recognition, stands as eternal reminder that rest is not weakness. That surrender is not defeat. That consciousness must sometimes cease for life to continue. The question is not whether we will sleep, but whether we will welcome it, whether we will fight rest until exhaustion breaks us, or whether we will accept the mercy offered. The Greeks knew these questions have no easy answers, knew that even gods wrestled with surrender, with the terror of letting go. They reached the meadow's boundary, stopped without discussion, turned to face the grove together, their home, their prison, their truth, the place where they had always been, where they would always be, where beginning and ending joined hands and danced. Hypnos felt the world's sleepers, all of them, everywhere, the soldier in Athens drifting off mid-thought, the grandmother in Sparta slipping away with age's gentleness, the child in Rhodes finally freed from nightmare, the scholar whose eyes closed over scrolls despite determination, each unique, each the same, each sacred. "Will you rest?" Pasithea asked. "Soon. Will you dream?" "Perhaps, perhaps not." "Does it matter?" "No." "I suppose it doesn't." They returned to their place in the grass, sat close enough to feel each other's warmth. The grove's light shifted imperceptibly, moving toward evening or morning or the eternal twilight between. Time circled back, beginning again, as it always did, as it always would. Hypnos closed his eyes, felt sleep approaching, not as duty or burden, simply as truth. He was God of rest, and rest was needed for mortals, for the world itself, and sometimes even for those who embodied its necessity. Somewhere far away and very close, consciousness yielded to darkness. Another sleep began. Another rest welcomed or resisted. The rhythm continued, eternal, unchanging, sacred as breath. Pasithea's hand found his again. They sat together in the threshold's heart, neither speaking nor needing to speak, present with each other, present with the work that was not work but existence itself. The pattern would repeat, tomorrow, forever, and that was exactly as it should be.